Oh, well, I've watched most of this video, save the last, I think, 4 minutes or so. That's when I didn't realize I was that close to finishing it, but I just felt like I should issue a general sort of response, and I guess it's going to be half going to be a response, and it's half going to be me treating a slightly different issue, because I think that Sam Vaknin, I think quite rightly, outlined certain cultural defects that we suffer from collectively, or that have creeped into poisoning the cultural well. Um, and he describes this as hope, as hope being a kind of a toxic ideological figment. Or that he doesn't describe it that way, but I mean that's what I believe he's signifying, or what he's pointing at. I want to see if I can just sort of clean up some of this and be slightly more precise, because I do think that Sam Vaknin, when he's talking about some of these issues, it's just a bit. I mean, it's useful for me to listen to because I get my thoughts in order just responding to his thesis and his, and he, he makes some very prescient and useful observations and historical sort of context. But I think that where he kind of falls down is that he doesn't see a way in which these tensions, these dialectical forces that are fundamentally at odds with one another, he doesn't envisage a way in which that they can be. Well, I mean, he's sort of almost making a kind of historical argument that this is where it seems that we're going, and he kind of gives up almost the notion that we have any hand in guiding the development or the precipitation of a new era, or in terms of how this epoch is going to be concluded, or how it's what the answer, what the synthesis that we're in the mix or in the midst of developing is going to sort of turn out. Um, and I do see, and this is perhaps Sam Vaknin's greatest weakness, is that he does not offer leadership um, in his judgments, in his prescriptions, or I mean, he's not technically that prescriptive. I mean, he's speaking in the third person when he's commenting on these things. He uh, when I obviously, you know his expert opinion is his opinion, so it's not. But when I say that he's speaking in the third person, it's a detached, dispassionate, bird's eye view of the situation, somewhat extricating himself and detaching himself from the participatory historical process, almost, which is, uh, I will sort of salt his expert opinion with that very somewhat disembodied and detached perspective that he is speaking in a kind of in a third person uh, uh, frame of reference to the subject that he's speaking on. Um, and I also think that therefore the tone of his opinion is also, on some aspects, it becomes a bit too metaphorical. It becomes a bit too, um, he's neatly aggregating the data points a bit too tightly into a kind of narrative, which, as I've already described, has a kind of leadershiplessness within it. But I mean, he's trying to perhaps give you a sense of what the model is, of what the forces within that model that you would have to contend with, and that you would have to sort of navigate and mediate between, in order to perhaps arrive at a decent sort of synthetic solution. How you could sort of get these things to um, in some orderly procedure be sorted out, or anyway. I mean, I believe that there is a way, there is a recipe, that there is, you know, um, that, you know, with the right sort of ordered priorities of enough conscientious people, that they can sort of create an example and a cultural model that could be a kind of a force for sanity, and a force for grounding the otherwise chaotic influence of these forces, which, you know, would generally tend perhaps toward. I mean, I don't think that we're just going to head towards feudalism. I think that's actually historically unlikely. I think that in the path towards heading towards feudalism, we'll have a kind of plutocratic sort of collapse. You know, it'll be like the fall of the Western Roman Empire. You know, it'll be a kind of cataclysmic. You know, that you know, it's much more likely that if things aren't stabilized and improved, that as things start to diminish into a decadent, you know, sort of doom spiral, that it won't just quietly move into a new configuration, that the whole thing will sort of will be like a domino effect of implosion, um, perhaps exacerbated by geopolitical tension or whatever, but or some other drama will take over and sort of be the anyway. There's no point in me going off in that tangent, but let me be more specific. So we're just. So I just want to more. So I mean, he correctly says that people are being driven into their own minds, and that aspect is very much like the feudal sort of arrangement. And I've actually independently sort of developed my own thesis around describing that. Um, I link it to identity politics. I think identity politics is essentially how people are being driven into their own mind, which is um, like a Nazi ideological narrative, like the fascist conception of society. Um, and I do see that is that narrative, that ideological narrative, is like a hybridized psychological schema uh, uh, that is a very sort of toxic and self deluded, you know, sort of form of filtering reality. And I just wanted to talk about it more specifically. So the hope that Sam Vaknin is talking about is what I would call essentially the investment into a self image, which is somewhat sort of pushing the accelerating. Like, usually culture has elements within it that buttress, like, let's say, a stabilizing psychology, which generally tries to inculcate people into inhabiting the ego function. Uh, so that people are sort of are are focused on developing their social mask. They're focused on developing the brain that is attached to their social mask, and their plotting that is attached to their social mask. That's usually what society is trying to do, is trying to get people to keep the inner child or the unconscious sides of the mind unconscious, and to get people acting in a positive way in terms of planning and managing their affairs, like, responsibly, having a kind of an internal locus of control, at least around their social mask, at least around their adult ego function, um, or their adult ego. So their consciousness is sort of, their seat of consciousness is is centered around their adult ego, um, where they somewhat accept what they are in terms of their self-image is already given, and then they are sort of navigating it from what they have been given. Then the hope that Sam Vaknin is talking about, and also how people are forced to live in their own minds and to retreat inside their minds, like in feudalism, like in the weird narrative of feudalism, is that what essentially is happening is that they are given an imaginary or a sort of a tabula rasa in terms of their adult ego, which is, so their adult ego is left unformed, and it is there to be imagined as a kind of as a self-image within their own mind. So they can sort of they don't have an adult ego. They have instead a self-image which is regulated by an ideological narrative, and so they're getting an external stimulus, which is the ideological narrative, which is perhaps being collectively projected for them. It's being contended for them by a collective. So I can see that this is how perhaps the relation between the religious orthodoxy and dogma within feudalism and within the narrative of feudalism, that sort of also tied the social structure of feudalism into that religious internal, sort of, and even that, I think, to some extent, in a, because at least then that fiction, if you, or that narrative, did have an external extent, it did have an external manifestation to that narrative, where there were very clear external parallels between certain things that would happen. So like if you were disowned by your monarch, by the sovereign, which was the representation of God's authority on earth, then it was sort of God and country, but country was part of the religious sort of narrative. I guess at least until the Pope condemned your sovereign perhaps as needing to be removed as a blight on anyway, but or a stain on the fabric of anyway. And there were interesting things within feudalism that were, you could almost say that it was beckoning people to develop a more independent sense. I mean, eventually of an adult ego, in sort of trying to cast them under the spell of this narrative, but trying to get them to root that narrative into their own bodies. And I gave an example of the executioners, how every crime would have a proportionate parallel to a particular sort of ritual that would be in terms of how the body would be treated, and that traitors or people guilty of treason would have, and I might be getting this wrong, but this is how sort of elaborate it was, is that they would have their nose cut off before they were drawn and quartered by horses or whatever. And so you can just imagine that essentially the disfigurement of the face as being essentially the just punishment that essentially to so the crime of treason was a disfiguring um, was had a representation in the disfigurement, and so you can see how people were connecting their relationship to their body, at least in a symbolic level, to how the narrative was, so, and so you can see the weird sort of mythology that then occurs around kings and sovereigns. I mean, people forget that, even in these so-called Christian nations, that thaumaturgy, that the hand of the king could cure disease. It was a very magical narrative. But anyway, um, so you can see that identity politics is very much the same kind of magical hopefulness, but it's much more of a personal religion, or you're capable of using this personal magical thinking because you are told, well, especially within, I guess, not within the sort of the Chinese version of identity politics where there's only one identity, but in the Western intersectional feminist identity politics where identity has many different tributaries, and it's sort of like the Lord of the Rings, many different subsections, and many different, 9 rings to rule the realms of men, and 6 rings to rule the dwarves, and 3 rings to rule the elves. That that then in that in that dark imagination that is distinguishing a sub component of identity, um, and its meaning in the world, and what it entitles one, based on this thesis of social justice, which is effectively the imagination that your identity deserves equality with any other identity. So you can just sort of, you can pick and choose at will how whatever somebody else has that you don't have is formed from systemic oppression. And so you can always embellish and excavate uh, the crime that was done to your identity to precipitate the fact that you don't already have it, that you don't already have whatever thing that then you could feel subjectively entitled to. So there's this sort of there's this imaginary self-righteousness and sanctimoniousness about what one should have already enjoyed, what one should have already inherited, and which other people have inherited. So just merely by the contradistinction of something else that somebody else already has is proof that it has been stolen from your identity and that you should have already inherited it. And so when you can, when that is your personal mythology around your identity, and when you are encouraged to privately cultivate that, um, I mean, where are you but living within your own head? You don't have recourse to reality, to navigating what's really going on. Uh, you know, you, trust has been disaffected. Essentially, the hope in that kind of self-image negates navigating life through cultivating and tracking and having account and responsibility for contending and curating a sense of trust. There's no such thing as trust in such a world. Trust is the medium in which that you parasitically extract what has been stolen from your identity. So essentially, everything is just a question um, of that somebody else is not trusting your subjective claim as to what you feel entitled, that your identity should have already facilitated you in inheriting. So you can see that trust is transformed into the ideological um, extraction, essentially, and then you don't have to navigate life based on pragmatic concerns. You don't have to understand how trust works, or understand how you can even trust in developing self-confidence or any sort of real life common sense competencies. Competence doesn't make sense when you have that kind of power of essentially saying that no, I am being systemically oppressed because you don't even trust my claim against the system. So it's always, trust is an issue between you and the system. It's not you actually having to live in a positive trust. Uh, um, you don't have to contend your own positive trust bank account and realize that when trust isn't going to fix something, it's because you don't even understand how reality works. Um, and so that you don't have a right to trust your own understanding of how the world works because you don't have enough knowledge. So you can't even blame yourself and try get yourself into the vogue of accumulating real knowledge and developing your own trust in your own capability to curate trust in such a way that you can actually make a positive and meaningful sort of progression on anything. And so it's a distrust of your individual capabilities to instead fully trust in the self-image of the identity and the tools and the instruments of the identity, which has this kind of ideological parasitic trust with the system. And so when Sam Vaknin is talking about hope, I think he's talking about essentially this toxic form of parasitic trust. That's how I would read it more deeply. And I think that in some sense, hope then can be saved from, obviously within the context of what he's saying, he's not wrong. But I would say that then if we understand that hope is something that is not is not like a kind of gamble, is not a chance, that hope is an intellectually, is a definitional kind of introverted thinking, in terms of knowing what something implies, that you know what something, the implications, all the implications that something portends. The reading of that is somewhat hope, and hope is also the hope is then also the basic ingredient upon which the fabric of trust is accumulated. Hope aggregates eventually into trust, essentially, because if you don't have a mind for knowing what everything that is implied by something, in some sense, hope is really ground zero of discerning. Hope is being able to discern the drive, the impulse, the engine, the character of the engine, the character of the intentionality. It's sort of knowing why something will be some way, what, and which is always a conditional contextual thing. Why something will be some way is going to be the derivation of who is putting, who are the personalities of the effort that are contributing towards contending it into being. Because the only reason why something will be some way, is because there are people underwriting it being that way, because there are people committed to it. There are people that have some sense of 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 inclination, and to the extent to which that you can trust that people have a consistent inclination, then um, then you can really start to synergize in the world. You can start to pragmatically deal with things. you can start to plan. Um, and so, at some point, it really is being able to understand character, being able to discern the elements involved. Anyway, and this is the so hope and trust are fundamentally based on tentative aspects, tentative elements. They're never um, they're never fixed in because if you just add one more data point, or you add one more element that you've discerned, you can completely recontextualize the your reading of the situation or your evaluation of the situation. Um, uh, yeah, the definition that I gave of hope earlier, I think is very important and very correct. That it's about understanding the kind of definitional implication that is involved in a preposition. Um, anyway, what was the other thing that I wanted to complain about? Oh yeah, so I mean, I wanted to get into further critiquing identity politics in the fact that how it deprives people of being able to discriminate reality. That essentially, and I mean, this is interesting because they use a kind of disgusting form of sort of I think it's called the fallacy of equivocation, where they use the same word to mean multiple different things. And so they have when they say that they are standing for equality, but then equality of what, it's not specified, and then they play these weird sort of semantic games, and they make it convoluted and confusing, and then they kind of use the same word to mean different things in different contexts, as if they've made like a solid rational argument. But yeah, they don't want people to discern reality. They don't want people to be discriminating individuals. They want people to discriminate according to their narrative. They want people's sense of discrimination to be locked into an ideological recipe in which that discrimination is like automatically part of the identity or the cause of the identity, or promoting the justice for the identity. And so their ideological discrimination is just, so somehow it's not prejudicial and it's not prejudiced. But then people aren't allowed to discriminate things based on non-racialism and based on kind of individual view of reality. They have to discriminate in life based on the cause of the identity, and in order to tilt justice towards the cause of the identity. And so by essentially destroying the capacity of individuals to have a kind of non-racial discrimination and a non-racial interpretation of reality that is not reductive to the cause of the identity, um, they basically have found a way to attack all forms of individualistic discrimination, that you can't understand, you're not allowed to understand reality in a non-racialist way. It's offensive to them if you are a non-racialist, because then you are circumventing their opportunity to promote the cause of the identity and to promote the imaginary, sort of redistribution that happens via the vehicle of the identity, in terms of extracting things using this kind of parasitic trust, which is emboldened when it is done by more people simultaneously. When it's done as a collective, then they can use that collective force as a kind of as an authoritarian, kind of cover, or as a kind of as a group think, sort of snowball of moral authority, that the bigger the number, the bigger the crowd, the bigger the mob, the more that they can successfully leverage this parasitic trust without it being questioned. Um, and then essentially the more that they can make this hypothetical claim for the cause of the identity, the more that they can just kind of disguise the fact that it's unsubstantiated, that it's basically asserted, it's just merely asserted as true, it's just presumed, um, as just part of the canonical premise of the narrative. And then with the narrative, it has this tautology with its disgusting racialist premises. Um, so its conclusions are used in its, as begging the question, and therefore it's fundamentally insulated from being picked apart. It's because of that tautological set of beliefs, it's captured within itself, and it's contained within itself, and it's self-referential, and it doesn't want to move from its imaginary predictive machine of essentially having hope in the cause of the identity and then being able to leverage this kind of parasitic trust on the external reality and use that as a way to mediate and filter reality into a kind of reality tunnel, which then, if people don't address you within that tunnel, then you kind of just deride them or bully them, um, or sort of try to get enough people that you can just kind of trample them. Um, yeah, so I mean, I agree that it's a form of sort of neo feudalism. I mean, that's a bit. I would just center it around identity politics, which we must remember that the progenitors of identity politics were the feminists. They were the ones who basically invented the notion of systemic oppression, because they didn't want to sort of actually demand specific things. They wanted to demand vague, nebulous things that other people must be responsible for delivering to them the solution that they will feel entitled to when the right solution is precipitated for them, because they can't even have the internal locus of control and the responsibility of articulating exactly what it is that they want, and then negotiating for it and arguing for it and hearing out the reasons against what they're asking for. But instead they use this dishonest ideological narrative of just complaining about systemic oppression and just citing statistics. And I'm going to repeat this phrase again, that statistics don't lie, but liars use statistics. And there are many dishonest pseudo intellectuals that use statistics in the identitarian movement. And I do think I don't appreciate some of Sam Vaknin's narrative, because I do think that he almost sort of, in his, what I've really kind of critiqued as a kind of leadershiplessness sort of purview of these issues. Uh, I mean, I guess, sadly, I mean, I can almost, I mean, I wouldn't say I'm sympathetic, but I mean, I can almost see what I think, what it is that he's doing, which is that he's already said some nasty things about Trump. I'll say that he didn't say anything, I think, particularly nasty about Trump in this recording. But I think he almost, he came, I mean, you know, how he describes these things, I can't technically fault anything that he really said. But, you know, I think that he roughly painted Trump, I think, as almost a good guy in this recording, although he didn't go that far as to say, well, what the what would a positive synthesis be in these circumstances? Like what would be the optimum, you know, kind of um, way of tempering plutocracy, and you know the kind of the negative financial narrative that he's trying to sort of paint. Um, I mean, to a large extent, a lot of what he says, I mean, in terms of the financial thing, I think is very insightful. But again, I mean, I think empowerment comes from blame, and I think we do actually just have to blame uh, people themselves for allowing their psychologies to be bought and sold, as it were. Because I don't like, you know, some of what Sam Vaknin says, I think, is a bit too far, sort of general, a bit. I mean, he's making good points, but is a bit too far reaching. Like when he says that, you know, people's eyeballs are being bought and sold. That their passivity is being commodified. And I also don't like the generalization about the internet being the problem. I think the internet was not the problem for a very long time. It only looked problematic after identity politics got off the ground. Um, and yes, the internet does perhaps always create this, let's say, dark incentive for people to sort of fall in on themselves, or to sort of, or to spiral in terms of their own psychology, you know, because they can find something that will just sort of appease them, um, and allow them to live in their heads. Uh, but I would say that that is not uh, that is not necessarily true, and it wasn't even always true. Um, and it perhaps is, it is perhaps it's a good thing to be pestered by, because perhaps that will inculcate eventually a sense of sort of protagonism, a sense of responsibility, a sense of independence at some point, that you have to sort of, you have to be faced with your dependency and the pattern of your dependency before you can overcome and confront it. Because I think that that's the wonderful thing about technology, is that it's reached, we've reached the point of information overload, and you need to have an information overload to start tracking patterns, because many people lived such small lives before technology that they were not able to aggregate a track record of their activities, of their behaviors, and now at least their patterns are recorded, or at least they are represented to them by their their history of their use of the technology, leaves an electronic record for themselves at some point, um, of their patterns, and that allows them to meta self-reflect, using the technology as an aid, as a tool for monitoring the activity of the mind, which would otherwise never go recorded or never because there was no interface through which the mind was being facilitated. Anyway, but just going. So yeah, I don't think technology is the problem. Again, I see it as part of the solution. Even I think the problem was always people's defective psychologies. Now we're at least at a point at which that it can be self-evaluated, or it's possible to allow it to be self-evaluated. Whether people, and I think that's why people are depressed, is because they know that they're not living up to their own internal capabilities and potential. Um, and if they want to sort of try to recover their sovereignty, then that just making the decision that they want to recover their sovereignty, or that they want to achieve a sense of sovereignty over these patterns, that's up to them. But that has always been a minority of people that went on that path. But at least now the trap is more evident, that people are stuck within some mind-forged manacle. Now at least the manacle is more apparent. So I see that as a positive historical precipitation. I just want to go back to a thing that I mentioned, that I was complaining that Sam Vaknin said that the financial narrative and Trump. Yeah, so complaining about inequality, I think the whole inequality thing is a whole misnomer. I think like inequality is not a measure of a differential in cultural power. Especially with the technology that we have today. And yeah, so I think Sam Vaknin has actually, by trying to conflate everything into the issue of inequality, that's not the same thing as social power and cultural power. It is scary that the internet looks like it might eventually evolve into being a closed system in which there are invisible censors, as in censorship, that there's an invisible hand of censorship that is only allowing the dissemination of corporate or any other elite, verified or validated thought or thinking. I think that is very, very scary. And to the extent to which there are already sort of elements of this, it's obviously very, that's kind of sort of terrain of an uncontrollably runaway, sort of plutocratic, sort of nightmare. But yeah. But yeah, inequality, I think, is a strange thing. I mean, we should be measuring things in terms of access. Uh, it's sort of absolute inequality, I think, is. I mean, if we only had institutions which, like, if they were higher learning institutions and it cost a certain amount to attend these institutions, and if the entrance to get into one of these places was standardized and meritocratic, and finance was always available to people no matter what their socioeconomic background, then I think that that goes a long way into justifying the claim that we have a society that is meritocratic enough and that is shared enough in some sense. Um, like really, what we should, as a society, we should care very much about kind of impermeable obstacles to access, and in terms of gating people or disadvantaging people. That I think is something that needs to. Yeah, so okay. Well, those are all examples of my general answer or my general response to Sam Vaknin's sort of financial narrative about inequality, but also about the the state of things. That I just started thinking about a response to something else. I did have a very condensed way of making this point, and now I've kind of lost it by thinking about slightly tangential points. But so I'll just make the tangential points first, and hopefully it'll come back to me. But um, the problem with these claims or these complaints about inequality is that it dispossesses individuals from the sense of navigating reality in a kind of in a robust way, in a positive way, because of sort of creating this collective condition which they are saddled with, and this collective condition being, oh well, actually the fact is that if you just wanted to buy these products, they could be a lot cheaper, but you're basically paying for the psychology of the product, of the marketing, and essentially the psychological warfare to get you to buy it. And and the fact that we could be feeding everyone if we just did things efficiently. And I mean that I think is a completely is a I mean, like, all of these measurements that Sam Vaknin gives as an example of, or you could feed all of Africa, and then you could just have them you could just have Africans save their money that they get from other sources, and in 30 years that they would be rich if they got money for if they got food for free, essentially, because then all essentially 70% of what they spent their money on would uh, they could basically put to investment instead. Um, that kind of sort of that bird's eye point of view, like looking at it from a system, like, I mean, I can give another one. I mean, you could just say, well, if no one bought alcohol, and if you just said in the whole world that alcohol was banned, but all the money that was going to be spent on alcohol would still be collected, and then that as a fund would go towards fixing all the world's problems, you could literally solve all the world's problems if you just converted one industry like alcohol into solving the world's problems. I mean, you could just, like literally, that would pay for everything. I mean, so I'm just trying to convert the problem in that it's not a defect in the system that is causing problems that can't be solved. It's a defect in individual choice making. And to say that it's a problem of the system is a false reduction, because how the economy works is distribution chains. And to say that like 40% of food is wasted, well, it's wasted along those distribution chains. Saying that you're going to like completely make the distribution chains more effective or more efficient, if you're going to maximize efficiency, if you're just going to distribute it all evenly, like, I mean, or you're talking about a state socialism model, or a state capitalism model rather. Um, you're talking about ordering things like the USSR, um, like the Soviet Union, and that's a cultural thing. That's like a kind of it's also an extremely political thing, but it's also it, it it's a political thing in that it is a completely novel and different social model and cultural model. And as soon as you have that kind of collectivized responsibility, now you've just created uh, a sort of an infantilized class of citizenry. Um, like I said, if everyone just didn't buy alcohol and they just gave to a well-run charity that was privately, I mean, you could also have the same effect in terms of fixing all the world's problems, probably. But okay, no, this is not exactly the point. I've lost even my tangential point now. But I mean, essentially, the I mean, I kind of agree that things should be done more efficiently, and they should be. But the only way to do them more efficiently is if you stably aggregate the correct amount of trust. Is that if you and it's very hard to aggregate trust and to do that on an organizational level, on a group level. It's very hard to stop trust from becoming essentially a dead husk, an empty shell that becomes a kind of ideological narrative or an ideological line or an ideological reality or vision, where it's just a kind of mirage, and that people still have to prop up the mirage because it's all they have, and then you kind of are in this some version of a kind of parasitic sort of trust. Uh, oh my word, I've lost my point twice now. And now I'm sort of circumlocating it, going around it. So I guess the problem with Sam Vaknin's, sort of complaints about the system and the reason why there are false reductions is because it's as if to say, well, if we just wanted to maximize efficiency at the cost of essentially turning trust into a tabula rasa, turning trust, societal trust, into, well, we're going to give someone power in order to maximize efficiency. And the only way to maximize efficiency is to essentially have no transparency or something like that, or somewhat to obtusely dictate to everyone that they just need to put up with the principle of everything is going to be distributed to you equally or evenly or something like that, or fairly or something like that. And then what does that even mean? I mean, that sounds like a very good enough generalization that everything is going to be divided to everyone equally. Can we really trust any system to orchestrate that mandate? I mean, to do that perfectly, you would have to make things fair in inverted commas. At some points, you would have to sort of, on purpose, you would have to create a lower grade product. You would have to equalize the quality all over the place. You would either have to say that everyone must produce things that are generic in order for them to be equally distributed from different locations of dispatchment. Otherwise, you're going to have something produced from any place being distributed to everywhere else. So you would have to have a very inefficient duplication of distribution just to make sure that everyone had an equal share of everything. Like, because I mean, basically, just to sort of make it slightly absurd, you would have two oranges, but they would be grown from different places, and maybe the one orange would be of a slightly higher quality than the other orange. Therefore, both oranges should be equally subdivided and transported to everyone so that everyone had an equal share of the different quality oranges. Never mind the other forms of perhaps coordinator privilege, of being part of the system, of designing the system, that there wouldn't be. Anyway, so it's a political question, it's a social question. Can you trust any administrator to fulfill this mandate anyway? And then essentially, well, if you're going to already cede over that kind of trust, if you're just going to give it over, and then you also say that, I mean, at the same time, you're going to have to take over all the farms, you're going to have to control everything. So you're going to have to induct many different systems that people already have, and properties that people administer themselves. You're just going to sort of nationalize all of that, or you're going to internationalize all of that under a single entity. There's a lot of trust that is being collected under a centralized authority, a centralized control system. All for the good of maximizing efficiency, supposedly. Maybe 40% of food that is discarded under the current system is perhaps even, you can say that, well, it's not 100% efficient, but maybe it's kind of the best that we can do with the tools that we sort of have. While keeping a sense of individually contended trust, while promoting a sense, well, if we want to do better, we have to actually do better as individuals, coordinating freely with each other, not with an external authority that is mandating us, that is compelling us and coercing us into falling in line with the grand overarching narrative and plan, which we have to just be adopted by. And essentially, without also that I mean, because you can also assume, or you think you're going to get a more efficient system when you essentially just control everything, supposedly because you can deliver more efficiency. But when you control everything and there's no competition, then what's actually there to underwrite the efficiency? What's there? There's no competitive incentive. There's no um, yeah. So I mean, there's no alternative node of supply essentially. So I still think that there are quaint forms or quaint. I mean, there are systems within capitalism that I think work very well. I mean, like the fact that there are different producers, especially in produce, especially in food, is actually quite good. I mean, naturally, there are multiple producers in those sorts of things. We only get into problems when things get horribly standardized and everyone is supplying them with the same GMO seed or whatever, and then they're essentially functionally conglomerated into a single sort of monopoly in some sense. That's, I think, the only real danger in those sorts of industries. But then there is really always an alternative, and there's a level of sort of healthy competition. I mean, the problem is that too many industries are essentially functionally oligarchical or duopolies, sort of two monopolies pretending to compete with one another. Anyway, I mean, there's probably a lot of health which could be brought back into the system if one were to sort of to cap the size of big corporations. And so after a certain point that they had to sort of just create another entity or something like that. That they couldn't get above a certain size. And so you would just have, if there was more work to be done, you would have to actually create a separate entity, which would also create a kind of internal duplication of some work, which would also make it more labor intensive, perhaps, but it would also mean that there were less points of failure, as it were, and also perhaps more opportunity for innovation and specialization. Anyway, damn, there was this thing that I wanted to say about the passive eyeballs. I can't remember exactly, but yeah, I mean, again, like I think that this is a problem that people deserve to have, and if they are plagued by it, they deserve to receive the blame for it, because now there's an actual incentive to create a more efficient alternative model to interfacing with the economy. Like I've always, to me, it's always been obvious that the way to solve these problems is to create a kind of a sub, what I would call a substate, in terms of that, like a virtual political community that exists within an existing nation, like a basically a virtual commune, and the commune would be regulated according to its own internal structure, its own internal rules, and essentially the purpose of that commune would be to um, facilitate capital investment, would be to promote the wealth of the commune by investing into amenities, essentially, which would eventually grow to become an alternative economic model. So essentially, so you can imagine that this virtual commune would perhaps buy a farm so that they could grow their own produce and they could sell part of that produce, or at least they could sell the part that they didn't themselves use, and then use that money to invest into more things, and until eventually they could do everything in house. They could make their own things. Obviously, they would perhaps not have access to everything, but then they could use some commercial aspect in their holdings to buy inputs. And they could be virtually self sustaining, perhaps by connecting up with other such virtual communes. And so essentially it would be like a moneyless society, but it would be internally governed, perhaps with some internal system. But that would be the challenge: is can you actually develop a society that's capable of being a relatively moneyless society that is self-organized and cultivates and maintains its own trust, and that can actually have the structure to not fall apart? Because I mean, that I think is the biggest psychological challenge, is that I don't think the average person is capable of living in a moneyless society. I think they're not robust enough. They want to be able to indulge in a form of sort of covert um, power game. They want to use something like identity politics or something like their own private weaknesses or imagination in order to imagine the things that they would like to uh, be entitled to extracting via some sort of imaginary self-image. I mean, I do think that that's the basic premise of the false ego complex, is the self-image becomes a mediating factor over that somewhat filters reality itself. Um, or this is just my description of the inner child. There is also something deeper than that, but anyway, I'm not going to talk about my whole model of the false ego at the moment. But I mean, to me, it makes sense that people's psychology is being bought and sold, because uh, I think people want to have their psychology fought over. They want it to be entracted into an external drama. Um, they want an external locus of control. And the elites in any society, I think stable societies don't feed that need, but plutocracies essentially get into a doom spiral with cottoning on to that, and you can sort of see it in the perhaps even uh, in the Roman times, when they had in of the Roman Empire, when they had sort of this addiction to the Colosseum um, events. anyway, yeah. So I mean, this is kind of one of my solutions to this, is that the way to navigate these sorts of issues responsibly is not to cast them as a narrative of systemic conditions and a narrative of some kind of systemic prison or captivity of the elites, but to actually correctly have people themselves accept the blame for this, that it is the so-called the lowly pleb who is actually indulging in this ideological narrative, and how hard is it to not have your eyeballs be passively monetized? It's not that difficult. Go to different websites, find an alternative, interface. I would say that the biggest problem that people have is that they just seem to have an unwillingness to take responsibility for these sorts of things. I mean, like, the biggest thing that you could say in terms of captured journalism and journalism being sort of full of lies and things like that. Well, you're not going to get independent, high quality journalism if you don't pay for it at some point, because someone has to spend their life doing the good work, and if you're not going to make it possible that someone is incentivized, or the idea that, oh, good things should just be given to you for free and that you don't actually have to be a part of making it, that you're not responsible for producing the thing that you want to sort of take for granted. It's that that's a self-fueling dilemma in some sense, and the lack of protagonism, essentially, the what would you call it, the impotence of the will. I think is very facilitated by the kind of hope that Sam Vaknin is complaining about. But again, I see it as a particular form of a kind of trust in a narrative. The kind of hope that Sam Vaknin is talking about, I think, is synonymous with trusting in a narrative. And I do think that at some points, Sam Vaknin sounds like he is a bit too enamored with constructing these intellectual, in, intellectually embellished narratives that aren't instruments of navigation, but are sort of a framework of captivity of conditions that are systemic. Okay, anyway, I guess I've said all that I'm going to say on these sorts of issues, but yeah, so let me just stop this, I guess, embarrassing recording. But yeah, I was going to go more into sort of discrimination and navigating life, and judging things, evaluating things, uh, from a non-magical thinking sort of basis, which is a way that I also say of which is also what I'm using in order to snub the identity politics, but also as a way, well, when I label it as being a non-racialist, non-sexist way of navigating life, which doesn't mean that you don't open your eyes to some generalizations that exist, but it just means that, well, you don't use generalizations generally to make decisions. I mean, because generalizations aren't good for making um, particular plans, but I mean, that doesn't mean that generalizations aren't generally true, but they're generalizations, so they're going to be junk in order to make moral calculations with. You're not going to use generalization, so it's not as if you can't make the generalization that, oh, yeah, many women today have very strange ideas about lots of things because identity politics has been geared at indoctrinating them into being essentially part of the mob, and to driving identity politics, and so that they have been treated in every sort of toxic way possible as in order to sort of maximize their imaginary claim against the system, whereas to minimize their individual ownership. And so they, have undeveloped characters and such like that, and they, I mean, there are also a lot of men who, but the thing is that when a man has a kind of pathetic mentality, someone usually gives him feedback for that. They are actually sort of judged as individuals still. Men are still judged as an individual, but women kind of get this free pass because they can always just claim you don't know what even feminism is. You can just they just sort of escalate into some kind of hysterical repetition of something. Um, I heard Bill Burr with someone he was co-hosting with on his radio show, and he was interrupted, I think, about 10 times. Uh, he could even like finish his point before being sort of hysterically dragged through the mud. And then at the end, when he actually finishes his point, he's, oh, that was actually a decent point. Because the ideological narrative has this preeminent claim on filtering reality, and there's always this easy way to kind of get people to absorb your general accusation that is used to kind of hold up some assumption that is needed for your ideological worldview. You can see this in the weird sort of shifting of the burden of proof by just creating, these blanket accusations and these vague, sorts of, oh, well, you're just being phobic, you, you know, uh, so that then the other person has to prove that they're not afraid of something before you can actually deal with their positive reasoning. It's somewhat ironic that I think that people that use the accusation of phobia are literally afraid of actually engaging in any kind of dialogue or real sort of free speech that makes their ideas vulnerable to inspection or scrutiny. Basically, people that use the word phobia are literally afraid of free speech. So they try to sort of preemptively bully people first. going to make this little addendum on sort of elaborating on how uh, at least this iteration of feminism, third wave feminism, is particularly destructive because, or fourth wave, or whatever it is, in terms of especially the identity politics, intersectional stuff, but just anything that just basically complains about a nebulous thing like systemic sexism or systemic oppression. Um, and so not describing the ideology specifically, because I've got many recordings of me describing how toxic the ideology is, but just sort of putting this perhaps in a kind of um, evolutionary sort of psychology sort of context. So obviously the biggest sort of discriminating factor in distinguishing the sexes is their the difference in the reproductive burden and the difference in sexual sort of sexual strategies. That male sexual opportunism is different from female sexual opportunism in terms of how they would explore and test for opportunistic uh, strategies which are low input, high yield, or something like that. So, and you would think that women, in some sense, and would be uh, configured or inclined and incentivized to be invested into some semblance of a functioning model in society, um, because stability um, is a bit of a requisite for most of the female strategies. I'll just repeat it from a section of what I heard Jordan Peterson talking about, that, basically women have found that a shortcut essentially is to just use social status as a marker of success, so that they don't actually have to understand and evaluate someone's value. They can just sort of take the prescription of whatever the current social norm is, the current convention, and just sort of use that as a symbol of uh, desirability. But yeah, so anyway, there's in some sense the male form of opportunism keeps the female form of opportunism sort of uh, in check to some degree. That there's a bit of a sort of a cross cancellation of some of these forces. That if society is too permissive to a kind of male opportunism, um, that it sort of erodes whatever stability there might be for a woman to have a stable resource availability and protection uh, for the for what comes after the sexual act, and in terms of the, the next stage of reproduction, which is so weighted as or at least troublesome for females. Um, and then, so, women have this kind of almost like a diode of concerns, which it seems to me even manifests a bit like a sort of a diode, that they um, are opportunistically looking for something that can be garnered, um, that provides a kind of pro-social a resource base and security, and they're also looking for positive traits which seemingly are being rewarded or are successful in the current uh, uh, you know, social order, or system. So, they're looking for markers of desirability, and they're also looking for anyway. So the thing that feminism, at least in its current carnation, seems to me to be related to is this notion of uh, that if the female sort of takes on a kind of a neotenic, a kind of sexual neoteny as a strategy for essentially taking on a role which is half childlike and half um, sexually mature female, that she is casting herself as a kind of social experiment, as a kind of cultural test. That is there enough stability? Am I, in my sexual neoteny, am I being pandered to? Am I being catered to? Because to the extent to which that I am being facilitated, then essentially I could perhaps not have to invest in being so burdened in the next stage of the reproductive process. Because in the same way that I was being pandered to, uh, whatever paternalistic interest is catering to that, they should have the access to organize, essentially supplementing the maternal provision of, that burden essentially is going to be redirected onto a so in some sense the kind of the mother has devoured her own maternal role by requiring a conducive um, set up an environment um, that provides that maternal role to herself. So she's kind of demanding she's demanding from a partner that they provide not only a kind of sort of uh, sort of toy masculinity to correspond to her uh, sort of facade of femininity, um, but because essentially the femininity is just a kind of is just a bit of a charade that's part of setting up the sexual neoteny. Um, and essentially the sexual neoteny, especially within the kind of the feminist context, is sort of heralded as the birthright of every female, as the kind of, that this is what empowerment looks like, that everyone should be treated as if they had this privileged power of being able to perpetrate this kind of strategy of sexual neoteny, and that it doesn't matter what you look like or how old you are, is basically, it's like the socialism of the free drinks, that every woman should be treated as a pretty woman and everyone should get free drinks, that the free drinks shouldn't end at a certain point of your age or of your looks, that they should be meted out to every woman. So it's this kind of this cultural um, so feminism in some sense is kind of like the elaboration of sexual neoteny as a kind of cultural norm that they are sort of invoking and imposing as a kind of as a standard, because there's something else that the strategies of women are used to doing, which is that women create the cultural mores to a large degree. Women have much more cultural power than men do, and this comes from a kind of from a two-edged sword kind of reason, which is because women have always orchestrated societal control and societal cultural power by functioning as a bloc, as a faction, by essentially modulating their standards as a group. They have been able to essentially manufacture social norms and create fixed standards, as it were, and this is why sort of slut shaming and things like that, which is quite ironically blamed on men or something like that. Uh, men might distinguish between someone who is a slut and someone who isn't a slut, but the actual you know, the actual consequence of that is is an individual judgment as to the psychological health, usually, of the woman involved. It's got nothing to do with a kind of fixed social connotation. It's not a prejudice. It's an actual individual determination. It is a judgment, but not all judgment is a kind of just a kind of bigoted um, sort of thumbsuck. And it used to be that women would confine themselves as a block, because they set standards as a block to sort of to prevent a kind of dissipation of viability. That they would sort of that they would, as a block, they would hold themselves back by sticking to certain standards that sort of kept everything sort of above board, that kept things functioning. Um, that norms reflected, sort of general, sort of common sense morality or facets of reality. Um, that you don't do certain things because they lead to bad outcomes, but essentially because all um, of those sorts of generalizations or sort of just kind of basic common sense has fallen under the banner of systemic oppression, because limits the choice of an individual woman, and no one else should be allowed to meet that individual choice with a kind of individual discerning or judgment or discrimination of any kind, um, because that would be a manifestation of systemic oppression. That you've kind of got the self-fueling, sort of doom spiral machine where it's like the demands get more and more delusional, and the expectation that a sort of a sense of self-entitlement, an insulated imagined self-entitlement, must be meted, otherwise they are experiencing systemic oppression because of basically that somebody else can be treated in this positive sense, and they want to be treated the same. And that's all they're asking for, is to be treated the same as somebody else, never mind the actual context, never mind the actual conditions involved, or the other factors involved. Um, no one is allowed to have any kind of moral judgment other than essentially the demand for equality with the highest status individual within the society. That everything should be modeled around being treated the same as the highest status individual. Never mind that status is comprised of many different facets and features. Um, so it's the sense that value cannot be individually contended or judged. It has to be bestowed by the faction in some sense. Now, again, like that has been a feminine mode of thinking uh, uh, for aeons in some sense. That is how they've been able to essentially perpetrate a level of cultural um, levers over cultural engineering in some sense. And it used to be that essentially they used this. I mean, I think it was always sort of toxic and poisonous, but they used this power in some sense, or at least the sort of the general traditional propaganda for the special power that women had was that because they were disempowered, perhaps politically, um, and perhaps they were disempowered politically because they had this excess cultural power, that essentially they could leverage this cultural power to secure their position and to fight for essentially special standards which were needed because of um, their more vulnerable position, uh, uh, especially with the fact that children, that the interests of women and the interests of children were sort of conflated. Um, Obviously, there's a whole set of toxic consequences from this, because this also means that women can be given the special protection to um, to not be scrutinized and to not have their actions and behavior questioned, and their style of, for example, parenting is just beyond reproach, is beyond, to a large extent, within a huge within a huge degree of, I mean, basically what I'm saying is that, there's a reason why there's so many male psychopaths in the world, and that's because there are a lot of, let's say, undiagnosed sociopathic and psychopathic borderline women who are perpetrating their crazy behavior just because it's somewhat, it's within certain bounds. It can stick to presenting itself within a certain narrative, within a certain um, and so as long as it sort of hits those sorts of targets, and it can kind of very superficially conceal its insidious and disgusting behavior, it goes beyond um, examination and inspection, um, no one can speak out against it because people don't even know how to deal with reforming a woman in terms of their poorly developed character. I mean, I guess the ideal is to not allow women to have, or girls to develop, a poorly developed character, but which has kind of already happened in Generation Y, um, because of this feminism reliance on systemic oppression. Once you inculcate within people that kind of excuse machine, then they're kind of fundamentally, they have been encoded by, I think, this variant of opportunism, which is that essentially they have taken on the valence or the guise of this kind of sexual neoteny. So I do think that a lot of the pathology and dysfunction around women is sort of, it's some variation of this sexual neoteny, um, or the strategy of a kind of sexual neoteny, and it's that sort of toxic theme, uh, and making that theme the kind of the norm requires a whole set of accusations, blanket accusations, which you have to sort of prop up as a narrative. This is a very dark uh, subject. And no more can you see this, in terms of how politicians have to sort of have this incredibly dim double standard, when you're dealing with these sorts of issues. You can just see all the propaganda for women's issues, and some of those issues are certainly valid, uh, issues that need to be brought into light. But the idea that you can sort of only bring one section of the population's interests into light and not the other section, um, you know, uh, is actually sadly the reason why we have these same issues. I mean, the reason why we have these psychopathic men is because we have these unaccountable women raising them, essentially. Um, and the kind of insidious abuse, because women that abuse their children are not, I mean, they can also physically abuse their children, but it's not really physical abuse. It's much more perverse and insidious. Um, it's kind of its exposure to borderline, the whole borderline sort of reality tunnel, and the kind of terrorism that occurs in order to enforce compliance with their sort of their narrative that extends to them, the kind of the powers of sort of puppeteering a reality tunnel that goes wherever they want to end up, in whatever direction, even as that reality tunnel has so much, kind of incoherence and inconsistency, and sort of, you can just imagine the amount of intelligence which is chewed up and disposed of, in the darkness of this kind of self-delusional, sort of maddening. I think it was in the 1940s, in the 1950s, where, uh, sort of psychiatry saw borderline as a mental health, as a threat to society's mental health. And that was the justification for essentially, removing these women from the family, even because they understood the damage done to children, and sort of the toxin. Um, so I mean that I find very interesting. That how is that going to be resolved in a liberal society? How is culture going to be able to police that? Because that's going to be, a very that requires a very concerted, almost laser focused sort of clean break that people are going to somewhat, it's almost like the ideal, I would think, would be that you have to create something like an Amish society, and you're not allowed to join that society, if you have borderline personality disorder. And if you're born within that society and you kind of cultivate a borderline personality disorder, um, that it's somewhat suppressed by the cultural values, or it's managed well enough by the cultural values within that society that it does not proliferate, it does not, or people within that society have the wherewithal to not reproduce with such women. Um, that they sort of they stick out like a sore thumb. They are seen as sort of chaotic and problematic, uh, sort of agents of a kind of parasitic trust and chaos. That I mean, a lot of this I think is a kind of intergenerational sort of personality disorder, and the only way to sort of end it is to break the cycle, as it were. Um, but how that happens without essentially either the intervention of a kind of public health policy, or in an educated culture that is vigilant to managing this problem, um, and and dealing with this toxicity. Sadly, it's I mean, especially on the cultural side, it's a more sustainable solution, because if people are vigilant themselves and are made responsible for being vigilant for this, um, then at the same time as working out how to manage these toxic elements, there's also a kind of solid immunization that's occurring at the same time, because a culture that is working out how to solve this problem and actually beat the problem on the ground in a cultural way will end up with a culture that is robust enough that it can actually, I mean, I would say the only sort of issue is that just how big is the problem? Because when sort of the majority of a population has the majority of a generation has already been effectively spoiled by inculcating within themselves this kind of this weird standard of treatment that is essentially premised in a kind of sexual neoteny, a strategy of sexual neoteny, but kind of collectivized as an ideological self-image, that
that makes a very voracious ideology, that makes a very power hungry, but also a convenient vehicle for sort of political advancement, because you can just imagine that, well, it's the end of systemic oppression if everyone just agreed with my ideological narrative, and so the cause of that identity, which is essentially the placeholder of the hope of what one would expect to derive, to be extracted via social justice, or to be delivered to the self image, um, via a conducive, sort of paternalism, of a kind of a fatherland or motherland or whatever, that is propping up the cause of the identity and is uh, uh, wiping away the hold of the systemic oppressions. Uh, that becomes a much easier process through which to derive and to extract a sense of progress, rather than have to contend life as an individual, navigating it with one's own individual discrimination of reality. Instead, it's much easier just to kind of have to just discriminate, well, what isn't being treated equally, and what equality of the highest status individual could I imagine enjoying? So you don't actually have to develop a kind of competence, or genuine self-confidence. You can just sort of say, well, the only reason why they have X and I don't have X is because my identity has been shortchanged. So it's interesting because essentially, obviously, I think it's just kind of unfortunate that the female that the sexual strategy for female opportunism is also kind of societally corrosive and toxic, and leads to kind of entrenching, that. And really, the only fix for this is to develop a more egalitarian uh, division of responsibility between the sexes. But feminism is toxic to responsibility. So that's, this is the problem, is that it's a sort of a self-fueling, deepening doom spiral. Um, but it's interesting that, at some point the male opportunism at some point generally does still depend on having attractive traits, does still depend on having some high status within the society, which is, I guess it could possibly just be based on looks, but generally, the older you get, your looks fade, and then you need something else to supplement it. You need some other sort of societal high status. Uh, and so, like, even male opportunism at some point has to work out a medium term or long game term. Even if they still want to continue to be opportunistic, they have to, in some sense, prove themselves according to their social high order. The social standing has to be, um, like, what I'm trying to say is that men have to develop some kind of stability about their standing. Yeah, this is perhaps a bit of a too tenuous thing. So, like, to be a male opportunist requires some kind of cultivation of uh, a kind of value that is being offered to society, at least on some level. There has to be some kind of societal admiration that then is converted into high status, which then they can use to fuel their opportunistic sexual strategy. So the male opportunistic strategy is still under the thumb of a kind of some kind of loose pro-social collective. It's still hooked into preserving or providing some collateral support to a social edifice or structure. I mean, perhaps even when men are opportunistic, they actually have to kind of parasitically corrode some of that value, because they have to kind of, whatever value that they're providing, that they are transmuting into high status, so that they can use that high status to act opportunistically. That value at some point then is going to be clouded by that transmutation, and therefore perhaps there's going to be a kind of ambiguity that is going to be introduced into how that is even value anymore. That the value that they are providing is going to be a kind of a double-edged, sort of entity that it's going to sort of be slightly denigrated, perhaps, or at least eroded in some abstract, discrete, sort of it's going to accrue some iota of ambiguity, at least. Or at the very least, it's going to be tainted by the fact that that value is being counterbalanced or counterweighed against the toxic effect of the male opportunism that is occurring. Um, but the female opportunism is a much more kind of slow boil kind of toxicity, that it kind of consolidates all of its toxicity, and it sort of can keep on ramping itself up in one direction. And so it's sort of, and you can see this in the Roman writers, Cato the elder and such, but in the description of woman as a kind of as a cultural player, because they function as a faction, as a block, and essentially, I mean, what Cato, I think, was also getting into is how women accrue, what did he call them, licenses. And then the problem is that once they have obtained a kind of cultural license to being able to do something, there is there's no way that it's going to sort of sacrifice or surrender that license, or to sort of sophisticate, or to um, or to delineate the frame of that license. So essentially, I think what Cato was largely sort of decrying is that, well, yes, let's afford women license, but we must be very tactful about how that license is constructed, how it's mapped out, how it's modeled. It must be modeled in a very, very particular and fixed kind of way, because if it's done with any ambiguity, it's going to essentially poison whole tracks and sections. It's going to create essentially industries of a kind of self-involved, sort of spiral of a kind of taking a symbolic sort of access that they might have to high status and making a kind of a cult around that, and then men become enslaved to having to kind of pander to that symbolic representation. You know, it kind of, I think what Cato is basically describing in it, although you have to kind of interpret what he's saying to some degree, is that essentially women will create a kind of a false economy around, when I say economy, I mean that metaphorically, they'll create a false economy of virtue signaling. Um, and there will be a lot of wasted resources infused into meeting the demands of that economy. And the whole thing will be will be essentially an arbitrary uh, invention. It just essentially to prove the power that women have over culture. And so I guess in some sense that's Cato's general critique of women as a faction, is that they will uh, oh, I've just lost my thread now. Or that they won't use their power of controlling society responsibly, that there's no responsibility check against the sort of the inexorable expansion of their licenses. And so, I mean, in a sense, I think this is only solved by the kind of the ideology of the 90s, of the non-sexism of the 90s, which we have to go back to, and we have to um, destroy this current monster of of feminism that without the equality of the 90s and that kind of that vision of egalitarianism, um, if we allow women to use this block, this factional cultural warfare, and uh, I mean, I've described it before that, you know, if they want to sort of engage in some aspect of the sexual neoteny, because to some degree, I mean, I can be sympathetic to it, because essentially there are men and women will naturally have different sexual strategies because they have different reproductive contributions. And at some level, women do have to judge a situation relative to the idea of how vulnerable they would be if they had a young infant that they had to care. They do have to track how stable their situation is, how stable people are supporting them and protecting them. So that is a kind of, that is an ingrained kind of awareness and evaluative, you know, sort of thing that they have to test their relationships for, that they have to monitor. They have to monitor those aspects. Now, a well functioning culture will, I mean, this is how it used to be to some degree, but to the extent that women wanted certain things standardized so that they could feel secure, um, there were institutions, that guaranteed women, uh, obviously not a perfect sense of security, but a maximized sense of of a reasonable kind of sort of insurance or guarantee, at least in terms of, you still couldn't do anything if your husband died or something like that, but and then couldn't provide for you like he would have if he was alive and working, but within certain limits. Culture was there to help facilitate and to protect women and young children, and therefore, at the same way, they were there to facilitate the. I mean, at the end of the day, this is really the problem that are women interested in being responsible for what it is that they want, and now they're interested in sharing a society with people that uh, don't have the same set of expectation. I mean, I'll say again, it's somewhat even ironic to try to frame it like that, because in some sense, feminism requires a section of the population that can be ideologically exploited into delivering to them what they feel is deserved according to the systemic oppression which they subjectively um, feel, as a kind of historical overlay or something like that, which is really quite ludicrous because that is essentially an ideological fiction. Um, and the extent to which that the culture isn't already in an egalitarian mold that they can be happy with, just means that yes, you do actually have to do some work in terms of delineating and constructing relations, uh, how you want them to be managed, and that there aren't already stereotypes for you to just emulate and copy. Oh, boo hoo hoo. Oh, that's so hard that we're up against all these disgusting social norms that don't already just give us what we want before we've ever had to bother to articulate it, that we should have already inherited a perfect role. This is why also I'm very upset with some of Sam Vaknin's framing of these things, which again has this kind of, I've described it as a leadershiplessness, sort of disembodied in detachment over the situation, where it doesn't even start to begin to try to solve its own problem, but it just wants to bemoan its problem as a vague and nebulous, unquantifiable, sort of issue, and just sort of complain that it hasn't already been brokered in their best interests already, or something like that. And I do think that in some sense the the, the the kind of way that feminism has formulated the problem is fundamentally insoluble, because women will have a more complicated and sophisticated, they will have more choices. Do they want to have a family? Do they want to work? Do they want both? How will they manage the integration of both of those things? Those will always be more complicated uh, than the male, um, uh, and that to a large extent is a biological holdover, more than it is a cultural holdover, especially with how society is at its prime for women to make their own. Uh, Society is at a premium for women to develop their own unique treatment of these things. But don't, when you want to create a unique strategy for how you want to maximize your own personal goals and purports or whatever, that doesn't mean that you can just bemoan that, oh, life is tragic and it shouldn't be tragic because men don't have to put up with this specific form of tragedy, so I shouldn't have to. That's not how reality works. You can't pick and choose like that. You can't sort of chop and change between, I mean, that's just crazy, sort of self deluding, self sympathizing nonsense. Um, you can't imagine the best of all worlds and just kind of conflate different versions of the best of all worlds and expect that you can get both without having to choose one path or the other path. It's literally just not feasible. And I mean, everything is ripe. Even in the current situation, everything is right. I mean, in some sense, the problem is that women are probably going to be given too much ground as it is, because whatever they say will just be interpreted as the holy writ because they have this mark of the sacred victim or something like that, and therefore we're not going to actually get a stable settlement because we've thrown away the morality of the 90s, we've thrown away the non-sexism, and we've developed this anti-sexist sort of rhetoric and bullshit and systemic oppression, wailing. Yeah, that was another element that I wanted to say, is that, just essentially the only way to actually ground any of these issues is to care about justice, is to actually philosophize about justice and to work out how to construe what justice is, and to not fall into the trap of generalizing justice into what is frankly social injustice, which has now come to be labeled social justice. It's so ironic, it's so hypocritical that the phrase social, that these identitarian ideologues have just accrued to themselves all these positive sounding labels. Well, don't you want social justice? Even though it's literally socially unjust to treat people as a scapegoat of their whole generalization, that you're going to treat men as a monolith, uh, that must be made subservient to any individual woman. Like it just, it's apples and oranges. You're going to contrast an individual circumstance against some generalization, and who's to say that that even holds? That's just that is a projection, that is an overlay, that is an ideological overlay, that is an assumption, essentially. And that's the kind of sort of dishonesty that has been baked into the kind of allowing women to function as a block and to set cultural norms as a faction, because that's what I've just said is actually the basic sort of toxin that has destroyed morality within our society and distorted the notion of justice, because justice for a woman has always been sort of this strange kind of juxtaposition of them complaining about generalizations in the interests of their own individual self case, and being able to relate to reality in that kind of weirdly ambiguous, sort of that cherry, because I mean that's just makes every issue then is ripe for a kind of cherry picked, then they can just describe how these general conditions, these boogeymen are up against them, and they don't actually have to navigate life responsibly as an individual. They don't have to contend with reality, essentially, because they can just complain that they're up against generalizations. So essentially, they're always failing because they're never strong as a generalization. and so then they need a generalized dispensation that's afforded to them to describe, like they need a kind of an ideological blank check. And it has been that blank check morality, essentially, that has gotten us to the extent to which that women are given the kind of wide berth that they're given to insidiously traumatize young minds into their kind of their undeveloped borderline cosmologies of perpetrating this very. So I mean, it's interesting that on some level, I think to a large degree, and I mean, I've met many women who when I've spoken about this at a high level with high level intellectuals, you know, they have reminded me of something which I'll just mention, because is that many well-adjusted women who do actually act responsibly in terms of their intimate relationships, they still like to explore um, these themes as a kind of as a role play. Uh, it's sexually enticing for many women. It's part of their sexuality. It's part of their expression of femininity, and I don't think that has to be sacrificed. It doesn't. It could still be a kind of, as again I say, like a sexual role play. It can be treated as a game. It doesn't have to be, um, because there is, let's say, a connotation within that. There is a kind of an implication within that in which, and in some sense, I think they could even be deeper. If it isn't generally accepted as a cultural, as a cultural, um, what's the word? Uh, if it isn't just automatically given as a cultural right or as a cultural normalcy, but if it is kept within the bounds of a private sexual partnership, and it is defined by the individuals themselves making a connection, it is defined by their own chemistry and their own negotiation of it, that it can be so much more deeper than having to kind of imitate an emulated sort of stereotype which women have used as a kind of as a cultural convention to kind of hold the line in some sense. And this, what I'm actually describing, I think, is even more natural to women, because um, feminists are probably going to hate when I say what I'm about to say, but that has often been said that male sexuality is is kind of at some point in terms of their development, it becomes generally hardwired. Um, that men like what they like and they do not change what they like, but that women's sexuality is much more conducive to being modulated by uh, the male partner that they are associated with. That they obviously within probably within some spectrum, but that they do somewhat create a an associative union of interest and uh, the sharing of their um, of exploring uh, uh, what is perhaps at base contributed by the man, but is then also elaborated and explored uh, in a helpful way by the woman, is essentially a creative act on her part. Is both a but anyway, I guess what I'm saying is that women are more. I mean, there will be psychological studies that I mean, because I've seen this. I can't remember, but I mean, there's ample evidence of what I'm saying, that female sexuality is much more malleable, basically. But in essentially in their choice to engage with that malleability, in their choice to elaborate and to choose to explore what they explore, is also how, and to a large extent, within at least the current sort of identitarian stuff, it's completely destroyed that kind of intimacy. It's completely destroyed that kind of very authentic, very primal way in which men and women share a life. Um, it's created a kind of ideological roadblock and obstacle to that by forcing people to have to take on these kinds of these conventional fetishes. Yeah, um, sorry, to fetishize almost kind of icons and stereotypes. I do, yeah, I've been wanting to add this to a recording for a long time, that identity politics, I think, has created a huge impediment within sexuality, um, to the extent to which that men have even been, especially probably within Generation Y, have been completely corrupted. Um, I mean, I read something. I guess I still don't know if what I read was true or not, but it was a woman, was ostensibly a woman. This was posted anonymously, who was asking for advice. She said that my boyfriend is trying to get me to change my look. He wants me to take on a very particular aesthetic, a very particular, sort of color code in how I want to look. And I mean, I just responded, and she said that this is her third boyfriend, and she always seems to choose the same type of guy who wants her to look a very particular way. And I just said, I can hardly believe what you're saying. I mean, because this is not what men are like. Men don't care how you look within a very large spectrum of, some sort of bare minimum of what's acceptable or what looks good. They don't care. Um, I mean, obviously within, like in terms of, as long as you are doing something, that makes yourself have exude confidence or something like that, and you're not, and there's certain sort of, things that you've ticked off the list, that you bathe regularly or whatever, it really, you know, within very many parameters, men don't care. Perhaps the only exception to that would be in very particular forms of sexual role play and intimacy. And again, that is not expecting someone to change their look. That's expecting someone to dress up, to act a certain way for a particular um, role play game in intimacy or something like that. Um, I don't even know how many men even care about role play. I mean, I don't think it's that many, even that. I mean, that's almost a fetish in itself. But and then just later on, I can't even remember everything that I said. I think I wrote about 4 paragraphs. But later on, I said, look, if you are telling the truth, then it seems that your whole generation has just been completely destroyed by identity politics, that you are so obsessed with superficial looks, that you have fetishized, these looks as to meaning something, that your whole generation seems to actually really believe that some kind of superficial uh, uh, mask, social mask, has a kind of mythologized essence that is built into it, and that, if you don't associate with the right mythologized essence, like basically that people have become so superficial that they believe that you can only trust the look, that there's nothing beneath that, there's nothing that's a real intimacy of a real connection. um, And this is very troubling because I feel that that might even be true. I feel that there's a kind of there's a canonical sort of conventional alphabet now where people only trust in the superficial. Uh, and I think that this also this exploded within Nazi culture as well. This is I think the kind of the level at which people are superficial today is a direct parallel to what was going on um, in sort of the end times of Weimar Germany. Um, okay, well, I guess that's everything. Oh, yeah. The other paragraph that I said is that people that would give so much credence to superficial things like this would not be, I guess I said this kind of off the cuff or whatever, but if a man actually did need a woman to dye her hair blonde or to have a certain wardrobe or to have a certain look or a certain color coded something, that they would have so many mentally, look, it doesn't mean that a man can't give a suggestion to a woman, but if it's anything more than a suggestion, essentially, or a kind of throwing out an idea or something like that, that essentially what you're dealing with is someone who is mentally unstable. You're dealing with someone who has so many mental issues and control issues that they would just not be suitable to have a relationship. They wouldn't be able to have, they would be a man child. Um, and obviously, look, there are gray areas in which perhaps, I mean, but there are also other forms of badly developed relationships because, there are ways in which women might want to feel controlled by their partner as a kind of, I don't know, as a kind of intrigue, as a kind of, or something like that. Which I already think is sort of moving into unstable territory. But and woman wanting to get into a kind of, that's almost like a role play thing as well to some degree, where they want to feel dominated and owned, um, and so where essentially they might pretend to have a certain drama around being controlled like this. And in some sense, I think that actually that's I didn't think about that, but that could actually be a very, if the situation that I describe in responding to this woman is true, that might be what it is. That it's sort of like that she has kind of provoked this drama around control, and she has actually precipitated the whole thing and manipulated the whole thing, and then she complains about it, which is actually almost the whole identity politics tactic in a nutshell, and the borderline, kind of um, propensity to kind of create its own confusion and then to look for a peanut gallery to give you some basic advice. Then you can just basically say, oh, well, I didn't come up with this response. Some peanut gallery gave me the confidence to give you this response, as this kind of external moral authority is needed in order to kind of ground the never-ending drama and tactics and cycles of decompartmentalization and such. But anyway, that's another issue. Just to recapitulate the underlying sort of crux and sort of the toxic paradox around sort of the problem with feminism, sort of, and then re-emphasizing what I was drawing from Cato the Elder. So the problem effectively is that woman, the balance would be that women would be responsible for contending or for having to curate their own licenses, in some sense, that they would have to be accountable for how they managed
their use of their license. But because essentially the license is not held by them as an individual, it's held by them as a feminist representative of a faction, of a bloc. The license is owned by the generalization. It's kind of like a social fact. It's a social convention. It's a social norm. So then individual women can actually do this weird thing where they occlude that license, where they kind of they disguise it and they conceal it, and then they bring it out at an opportune moment. So they can sort of trap people with this social fact, as it were, so that they can kind of pretend that they were operating in a different sort of way, and then they go back to representing the power that the license, and so they can play this kind of this covert social manipulation game, and then they can do this to kind of entrap people into having to uh, sort of leveraging a kind of social pressure in order to extract some, rather devious sort of opportunism in some sense. Um, and so this sort of means that then women are perversely incentivized to play that kind of game of social manipulation rather than actually contending things directly and openly, and and having a kind of a sense of what you see is what you get in terms of their integrity that they hold out, because there's so much that can be garnered, there's so much that can be gained by playing the social manipulation, um, of essentially using the license which belongs to them, that belongs to their identity. It doesn't belong to them as an individual. And so they can always sort of rely on that. They can always take deposits from that cause of the identity as a social fact. And so that's the kind of that's the toxic conundrum that essentially there's no, and the other way, I mean, so in my vision of actually having the best of both worlds, and somehow, because in some sense you can understand why there would be a kind of lowest common denominator social convention that allows women to perpetrate something like this, because it's a social extension, it's a cultural extension from the natural sexual strategy of opportunism that women have, which would be essentially to use a strategy of sexual neoteny in order to effectively try to extract um, uh, the easy, so it's the easiest way to kind of test the waters if your environment, if your social container is stable enough to help you rear children without you having to actually do the work, but sort of offsetting that work by being attached to someone who just provides everything and provides sort of servants to deal with that. So it's this sort of woman scanning social stability for a niche that they can exploit. Um, that if there's an opportunity available to them, which essentially they can test the waters of much more clearly, they can test the opportunity for, by sort of using this weird sort of hybridized, where they are both an individual sexually mature entity, and then they are also a kind of lolita, kind of stereotype. Uh, uh, Okay, where they are their own infants, that they are trying to manifest as being their own infants, that then garners and is entitled to being pandered to and catered to and infantilized, um, and then they can just kind of demand a particular form of infantilization that is sort of projected from their specific social manipulation and leveraging of the particular licenses which belong to the identity and not to them. So they can be this kind of naive, innocent, feminine thing that is just relying on the expectations which
she has, which she pretends to be culturally indoctrinated by. And so there's that kind of so you can kind of see how the concept of responsibility is kind of collectivized into a kind of codependent or codependency, which is kind of socially buttressed by these conventions, by these toxic conventions, which Cato called licenses, which is actually, that's a pretty ingenious, I think, way of describing the crux of the poison, as it were. Um, but also, okay, so my solution of having the best of both worlds in some sense is that women can still have similar dynamics, but they have to actually negotiate for them. They actually have to find someone who contracts into delivering those things. They have to be specifically um, negotiated by a particular two people. That they can't just be it can't just be the social leveraging of the social pressure and the social manipulation, and you don't know which license she is going to kind of, which card she's going to play. That essentially the cards have to be jointly consented to, that those are the cards that are operative in the uh, you know that those are the cards that we consent to play with in some sense, and that there's a kind of responsibility over directly and openly contending these things, that they're not just kind of post hoc invoked, that they're not just kind of um, unilaterally dictated in some sense. And to the extent to which that, like, you could say, well, women are driven by their emotions, and sometimes they're just so emotional and they don't realize that they actually are going to change their mind, and that they're going to, culture had a kind of palliative, sort of general knowledge about, well, uh, that things must be so constructed so that women end up being catered to, because they aren't accountable for their own minds. And the sad truth is that there is a section of the female population which, well, I mean, there's a reason why women have a higher rate of borderline personality disorder. Is I mean, maybe we can get that number down. Maybe if the culture was more egalitarian and forced women to develop responsibility for being direct and open and honest, and they developed a more mature um, personalities in some sense, that this that we wouldn't have to have a kind of, we could have a cultural sensitivity, but we wouldn't have to have culturally prescribed regularities of conventions and stereotypes. Obviously, there will always be knowledge of generalizations, which we'll never be able to quell, because that's also um, part of the medium of culture itself. And trying to complain that certain generalizations exist within general consciousness of society is a vain complaint. The only way to novate them is to actually look at the underlying truth, and if there is a kind of an injustice or something like that at the core of it, um, that is creating a kind of a false reading of the situation, then you can kind of try to leverage the other side of the story. Um, and that's also how culture can refine itself or whatever. But sadly, there's so much of a caveat that you cannot do anything that is against the identity of females, that is against the cause of the identity of women, or something like that. The cause of the identity, um, and its sacred victimhood trumps all other voices, trumps all other reasoning, it trumps all other you have to close your eyes and believe in the blind faith of the ideology, of the cause of the identity, so much so that the things that are complained about will just continually happen because the actual true cause is not even being surveyed, because there's an ideological narrative and assumptions that people need to have their worldview fed to them, um, which is quite similar to how borderlines often require their feelings to be fed to them, and pandered to, how they kind of get inebriated and drunk on their own subjective frame of reference, so much so that they're incapable of um, taking any, well, I mean, because essentially they're allergic to responsibility, essentially. Um, the only thing that they hold themselves responsible for is leveraging pressure onto somebody else to provide to them what they feel entitled to. Um, it's this kind of, well, I've described them many times as sort of greedy trust parasites, trying to create elaborate sort of circuitry of a kind of social manipulation and manipulations of other kinds to convolute situations to the extent to which that they can just kind of expect that their demands have to be complied with because they've got sort of uh, too much weaponry and collateral damage sort of under their thumb to being triggered. Often I think that what borderlines are trying to do mostly is to sort of create a history that is confected enough that they can, this is how they lay down a kind of structural decompartmentalization so that they can get to the point of establishing the house of mirrors, which is where they can play these juxtaposition games where they can kind of set up the other person as the perpetrator and set up them as the perfect victim and to chop and change, and then they can also pretend to be the perpetrator but a kind of like a white knight perpetrator, and they can kind of toy with reality to such a delusional extent that they can kind of redraw all the roles, and then they can kind of fluidly change their role as they wish because they've created a fabric, a medium in the codependency, which is so permissive of them being able to just dictate reality on the fly. Um, that's the kind of the end game. Uh, so I mean, yeah, I mean the problem is that these sort of corrupt things, they're so poisonous to reality. They're so poisonous to so allergic to responsibility that essentially, I mean, they're just fundamentally dangerous people in a very sort of insidious way. It's not a good time of history when they hold the cultural hegemony. Sort of basic common sense realities, everything becomes filtered by these weird sets of conventional double standards, so much so that you can't even understand what's going on underneath. You can't get to a pragmatic sense of navigating your life. It becomes made impossible. Um, because of their strange narrative games and semantics and such. Um, but this is what's all packed into the, sadly, to the elaborated version of essentially um, leaning towards embellishing and entrenching a social convenience for a woman that establishes and protects their sexual strategy, or their neotenic, uh, neotenic, uh, neotenous sexual strategy. Um, the Lolita sort of thing. Um, Made famous by the movie, or by the I I can't remember who wrote the book, but the movie was a Kubrick movie. Anyway, so yeah, I do think that there is a way in which women could still somewhat play that game, and it could be there could be a healthy version of the game, as it were. But to contend that directly and openly, and to know that it is a game in some sense, then it loses all of its power, and in terms of, because it doesn't provide avenues of social manipulation, it just provides a form of private entertainment in some sense. And maybe some women are not even interested in exploring sexuality in that way. Sexuality has always just been an instrument of extraction, has always just been a medium for them to establish a kind of parasitic extraction. I mean, borderlines, I think in general, are basically solipsistic. Um, I mean, there might be some borderlines that can sort of peek over the wall of their structures to some degree, and they're stuck in their structures, but then they do have a kind of, but I do also think that that's one of the themes that they try to pretend is going on in order to continue the games of social manipulation and the unilateral sort of compulsion and decompartmentalization, which is a very sadistic, psychopathic form of personal destruction in establishing their codependency. Um, but there is a spectrum of health perhaps with borderline cases, and there are some borderline cases I think that do get very close to simulating normal relations. And they can actually control. Male borderlines are famous at being able to effectively bottle up and control their the general tendencies of their structure, and that might simply be because that the male identity just has less power to leveraging social conventions. I find it very amazing that male borderlines essentially they live, or there's still a spectrum, I guess, of healthy ones or ones of various powers and capabilities, but there are some male borderlines that are quite vigilant in looking over the wall of their own structures, uh, and mediating their own sort of the extravagance, because they can't do the kinds of things that women can do. They can't just sort of throw their toys out the cot and play this kind of infantile role. I mean, some obviously do, but many male borderlines, they actually have to doubly check that it's safe for them to explore their borderline extravagancy. They have to make sure that they've created a plot which is very, very constrictive, and gives them opportunity to indulge in their borderline structures. And that, I think, might just be a pure reflection on the health of the conventions that are enabling their levels of social manipulation, that males or men just have much less opportunity to leverage the kind of social manipulation that is needed to conceal borderline predation. Uh, and again, if we had a more egalitarian sort of cultural lid on some of these conventions, if we embraced non-sexism and non-racialism, then we would have, I think, much better mental health outcomes, and be able to suppress within borderline individuals. Would be able to suppress their more pathological extravagancies. I mean, they're I was going to bring. I'm not sure what. Whenever the Anchorman, the Anchorman movies. What's the name? His name in the movie. I can't even remember. I'm very bad with actors, but it's a very. It was either in the 70s or the 80s when the Anchorman is sort of set, and it's a very interesting culture in that time. Um, I mean, you can tell how women were different. How they were fighting for their liberation, and they were more competent. You know, um, than the cultural, sort of encouragement and perverse incentive into retreating into your mind and being self-delusional and just being self-entitled via the vehicle of your identity. Um, but the roles were so well defined that there was enough of a clarity and a transparency in terms of seeing the individual as a unique person, as it were, to define their own navigation. That there was a clarity in that. In fact, there was so much clarity because people were so unideologically possessed, and how they were invested into their social mask and had to plan and had to navigate their own fates, as it were, and be responsible for their own destinations. That it's interesting that was the fruit of having very rigid social expectations in terms of that job descriptions were so well culturally stereotyped that the stereotypes were not policed, but because there was such a um, uh, what's the word? There was such a canonical and strict sort of stereotype of expectation that no, what I'm trying to say is that there was so much consensus in that stereotype. There was so little variety in that stereotype that everyone fell short of the stereotype. So everyone was somewhat individual, but the expectation was so rigid that in terms of the ideal, so the ideal was so singular that um, people could very easily just be trying to attain that ideal, and then they would be forgiven whatever sort of that they fell short of. But because there was only one ideal in some sense, um, this is very complicated, and I'm sort of fumbling on this a bit, but the most interesting thing in Anchorman was that one of the characters in Anchorman, I believe it's the weatherman, played by Steve Carell, is literally retarded. And this this character in this movie is based on reality. That there was a weatherman. Ron Burgundy was the anchorman. I can't remember the name of the weatherman, but there was actually a weatherman in this period of time whenever it was based. I can't remember, in the 70s or the 80s. Um, or maybe it was the 60s. I don't know, 60s, 70s. Anyway, that there was actually a weatherman who was literally retarded, and no one knew because everything was very clearly delineated. Everything was was made simple, as it were. And so you could actually be retarded and no one could pick up on it, because the kinds of small talk, the depth of the interaction between people um, was regulated so well by conventions and norms that a retarded person could play to those cues. A retarded person could meet that that aesthetic, that style, or could be seen to be fulfilling those ideals, because they were simply delineated. Uh, there was no ideological sort of inception needed in order to imagine. You didn't have to imagine the standards that you had to fulfill, because they weren't part of this paradoxical license that has this kind of double standard and hypocrisy attached to it. There was no double standards. There was no hypocrisy. Perhaps there were double standards, but there wasn't hypocrisy. But in some sense, I don't actually think there were double standards. In some sense, there were lower expectations for women than there were for men, and and women were angry with that, and men weren't angry with that. And so women wanted to change. They, in a sense, they were asking for more accountability, more scrutiny, to be treated just the same. And sadly, that has now gone a very toxic route with this, with the sort of the a kind of a layer of ideological double standards to to somewhat bring back the to de facto recall us to the traditional setup, uh, while preserving the semblance of the rhetoric of liberation for women, while it is in fact the a kind of a toxic uh, what's the word that means that, like, you artificially produce something that's like fraudulent. Forgery. The forgery of liberation for moral corruption and the corruption of politics. It's interesting as well that, I mean, Sam Vaknin says that we're being driven into our minds by these elites in some sense. And who is the only person that is trying to protect education from identity politics? It's the Trump. It's the Trumps of the world. It's the Boris Johnsons of the world that are standing up to this sort of toxic ideological indoctrination. Um, and if you just look at the internet and how it's being policed to be as positive as possible to the cause of the identity, and try to censor any dissidents or dissent against the cause of the identity, and how that is basically the big corporation uh, way of driving people into their own minds. Um, and the idea that anyone other than Trump, would be doing these kinds of cultural revisions or pushback against what is, the kind of the consciousness of this neo-feudalism, which is essentially identity politics. And I mean, Sam Vaknin still has not. He always says these strangely ambiguous sort of things, these weird sorts of pro-feminist narratives to some degree. Anyway, I'm just going to chalk that up to what I generally describe as his sort of dispassionate, objectifying, sort of leadershiplessness sort of purview of the issue. Anyway, that's enough of me ranting, I guess.
It behooves me to go back and to clean up some of the embarrassing things that I said in the prior recording that this is going to be addended to. This preceding somewhat editorial note. So the embarrassing thing is I should clean up what I was saying about the Anchorman 70s, 80s thing. So when I say that they had these stereotypes, they had these ideals, and I think I might have called them like conventions, but they weren't really, it was conventional thinking of the time, but it wasn't an orthodox convention. It wasn't a convention about orthodoxy. It was a convention about an ideal, and there was, and what I was trying to describe is that there was a solitary ideal. There wasn't a plurality in that ideal, and because it wasn't an orthodox, but because it was such like a tight consensus in the culture as to what the ideal was, in terms of what the target was, as it were, there was quite an enriched, I would even call it, culture of individualism, because everyone would have a unique contradistinction to that ideal, because the ideal was so uh, uh, in order to have such tight consensus, it had to be really low resolution. It was, it was like a caricature. It was quite a tight. It was such a strict stereotype, but the content that it contained was quite vacuous. It was essentially an image. It was almost a superficial sort of depiction. It was almost a kind of a collection of also sort of sentiments. And so how those sentiments could be like inculcated into someone's unique take on that ideal, which they would always fall short on, there was a lot of leeway in terms of that individualism. And then there were some, let's say, traditional aspects to those sentiments, or there were some traditional themes within that very, that caricature, that quite vague depiction, as it were. And so, I guess, that can also be how a culture has a kind of sacred cow prejudices and things like that. And I would even say that that was that was when authentic feminism existed. That was when, like really proper feminism existed to break barriers. And it was a much healthier culture to exist in, but essentially all they had to do is distinguish themselves as individuals and to sort of make their own stereotypes that were associated with women. That women could do it just, that you could have a female anchorman just as you had a male anchorman. And, their idea was just to try to create some ideal in the vogue of a female. And then you would have perhaps the same healthy thing where, the ideal would be somewhat not even expected, but it was, a kind of a loose, landing lights, as it were, so that just you had a baseline reference as to map the uniqueness of an individual in, being sort of distinguished in contradistinction to that low-level stereotype, because the stereotype was not there to be lived up to necessarily. It was there to it's weird because in some sense you know, there's a lot to be unpacked in the in the Anchorman movies themselves, which have this kind of richness. But I mean, it's actually very complex and very deep, which is why that point, which is one of the most interesting points to synthesize and how you unpack this, is how people that were literally retarded could function well in this culture because of how clearly delineated the the kind of the normative ideal was, how simplistic the normative ideal was, um, that made it quite simple for people to exhibit functioning according to the ideals that the culture had as guideposts to tracking behavior, which again I say the ideals themselves were not that important. They were just a kind of an anchor point through which one could um, delineate a unique sense of style. Uh, and so you know, I don't know how to describe this, but essentially this is a kind of system which is very vibrant because it's value based, actually, because the stereotypes are caricatures and depictions in low resolution, but the sentimentality that are the segments of each of these depictions, the sentimentality that makes it up, are just a superficial representation of something that should mean something underneath it. And because essentially the depiction is in such low resolution, it can either carry robust values and essentially, what, I mean, this is the thing that's explored within Anchorman is, like you have this image, you project this image and you're achieving, some kind of cultural stereotype, but what's actually underneath it? How, is it hollow, or do you actually have a real character? Do you have real character animating this image? And that is a perennial metaphysical or existential, sort of concern that cannot be, that has to be proven in each generation, that has to be derived in each generation, that you can't, there's no way that you can create a symbolic thing that, oh well, if you superficially tick these boxes then you are accorded with integrity. You can't do that. It always has to be tested, it always has to be doubted, or something like that. So this is a natural process. um, so I mean, this was a culture that I think was still functioning. It still had the capacity of, because it had enough consensus within it, that then people could navigate from a superficial starting point and then investigate themselves personally, they through negotiation, as to what meaning actually undergirds these images. But essentially there is a conventional image system that is the sort of just the starting point. It's the beginning of the game, as it were. That's all culture is. It's a canon of conventions that gives you, basically just saves you time. That's what a convention is that we both have a duplication of what something is supposed to mean. That doesn't mean that it means what it's supposed to mean, but that gives us a common vocabulary, just so that we have a shorthand, and we can perhaps engage and trade in sophisticated concepts that don't have to be completely reintroduced as you're trying to speak them. Try to communicate without language. It's that kind of proposition. It saves you time. Um, the actual words themselves. I mean, this is just the cultural parallel of words. Um, anyway, yeah. So just to tie this back into the general sort of theme, though, is that when, and I mean, I do think that women in some cultural sense have always had this kind of this toxic edge where they have spoken on behalf of women as a faction when they've decided to represent their identity, um, in making pronouncements or issuing critiques or questions or statements or declaratory um, positions that they have issued, that when they basically speak on behalf of accruing licenses for their faction, for their bloc, and when they've played that kind of politics, which is essentially identity centric, which is that, when they speak on behalf of their symbolic power instead of speaking on behalf of them as an individual, because they are wanting to proactively, um, directly shape the kind of the canonical stereotype and the power of that canonical stereotype, and they want other people to respect that stereotype. So it's just a kind of, they want culture to be an automatic thing that they unilaterally direct or something like that. I mean, that's been the toxic sort of evolution that feminism has now taken, which is that don't treat us like men, treat us separate but equal, the same and better. These weird kind of paradoxes, that we are exactly the same, but we're also better. We're also morally better, but we're also the same. Just it's this weird sort of Mott and Bailey, tactic. It's and that's essentially because they keep on wanting to channel this, essentially this power of inequality, and essentially these unequal powers that they wish to contend as a kind of historical recompense, as a kind of retributivism, as a kind of revenge for history or something like that, or some mythologized narrative, um, about the treatment of all women, which then suddenly the interests of the generalization they get to make profit from, um, or extract some kind of token benefit, that they become the symbolic recipient on behalf of all women or something like that, um, at a time of their choosing, at a cherry-picked, sort of interpretation of some subjective, relativistic, tautological, circular argument that they're just going to spring whenever they find the social manipulation that makes it most convenient to spring at that time. Um, that they undermine themselves. At least as individuals, and they also make it sort of, the more that, if you rely on this sort of this power of inequality, that is cast in your narrative, then essentially you become dependent on deploying that narrative as the solution to everything. So they can't even deal with common problems and pragmatic issues without essentially viewing that issue within with it, through the filter of the identity, and essentially the case for an expanded license or something like that. Um, so in the 90s, I think that we had actually gotten through this, and then somehow they snuck it back in, um, with this the kind of this narrative witchcraft, and systemic oppression. Uh, Essentially trying to, instead of participating within culture and sort of behaving in such a way so as to change the cultural interpretation and the culture, instead they want to fix the practical problem by sort of, uh, by amalgamating trust, or by taking over trust. Even the notion of trust is just occupied by their ideological vision and narrative, so that people can't have their own sensibility as to what to trust and what figments to have in their cultural stereotypes, that people aren't even allowed to consciously curate them, curate these things by themselves or unconsciously as they so might wish to do, but they have to curate them being tethered in sympathy to the ideological narrative, that is the correct way to have culture policed. Essentially, these are cultural totalitarians, and essentially women, even throughout history, has exercised this kind of cultural totalitarianism, and this is essentially why they were barred from politics. This is why traditional society put a firewall between women and essentially getting involved in policy, because essentially their planning does not manifest lockstep with their expectations and sense of entitlement, which they essentially, again, from Cato the Elder, they are not, I can synthesize what Cato the Elder was saying into a small preposition as to the paradox of woman as a malignant social force, is that they will not be responsible for contending the licenses which they claim to have accrued to their faction, to their bloc. That as and the kind of and the economy of perpetrating those licenses never rests as a burden on them. It always gets diluted and dispersed across the system. And so, quite ironically, that they are almost this natural reactionary force, that they create the problems that they themselves then complain about, and they don't take responsibility for it. Because when they exploit these licenses and they exploit the special cultural power, it's their birthright, it's their natural special power, or something like that. They won't give it up. They won't give up this exploitation of culture, where they're the only ones who are allowed to amalgamate into a block of power, and everyone else must be an individual. Or they'll let other people amalgamate into an identitarian cause, but then there is a kind of hysterical totalitarian, sort of feeding order and pecking order, in which redress must be dispersed by a kind of political program that is completely entrenched into mediating and arbitrating between claims made by identitarian factions, and that to me is indistinguishable from fascistic politics. That is the fascistic conceptualization of society. That is looking at society in the same way that a fascist does. That is what intersectional feminism is. And it just doesn't work. I mean, it's not even practical. It doesn't even, it actually creates the problems that it complains about, ironically. Anyway, I'm not going to repeat that whole sort of thing. But, and again, this tendency, I think, has been because, I mean, this is not all women that do this. This is a certain section of the female population that are basically, I would say, are borderline. And they like, or sort of generally, some kind of cluster B kind of concoction. And they will naturally, I mean, they've created this niche within culture. They have found this sort of this thing that it because it has probably evolutionarily proven to be pro-social, because the idea that women have been able to raise their privilege through the exploitation of culture has been good for the species, because women essentially it just put more pressure on men to perform and to deliver up to higher expectations and to compete with themselves to deliver to a kind of contestation as to who would be able to provide this, this unchecked sense of self-entitlement. But that self-entitlement has meant that women have been protected, men have been disposable, And again, that's why our species beat the other hominid species, because when we fought the other hominid species, our men would die, and the hominids that we fought against, the Neanderthals, when we clashed with them, we killed not only their men, but we killed their women. And so we overran them, because all the more egalitarian hominids were uh, it just in terms of competitive tactics, um, our strategy was more uh, sort of on a game theoretic basis. Our strategy was because if half the men in a generation were killed, but all the women were preserved, there was no incumbent on your population expansion. And so we just beat them with numbers, essentially. We outbred the other species and essentially privileging women within the tribe, within um, human specialization of work, hunter-gatherer, the hunter-gatherer distinction, essentially. And again, I've made this case before. I'm not going to go into this, but essentially, this extra cultural pressure made us more sophisticated, because if you didn't keep this stuff in check, if you didn't have some kind of cultural way of mediating these tensions, because this is kind of like a hotbed of cultural. I mean, this is like cultural gunfire. It's like it makes you strong, but it can also explode, and it can also take over your society. It can stultify culture. If essentially you get taken over by these borderline values, if you don't find a way to have a vigilance as to its corrosive impact and its kind of stultifying, sort of how it makes people stupid, how it makes people kind of delusional. If you can't identify it and kind of control it, it's kind of like a sexual game that gets. I mean, again, like I would just say that I'm correct in the general distinction that essentially there are two opportunistic sexual strategies. There's a male opportunistic sexual strategy, and there's a female opportunistic sexual strategy. And it just so happens that the male opportunistic sexual strategy is not as destructive as the female one, and the female one is kind of like a prototype culture sort of poison pill that also accumulates. It's a poison that sort of, it doesn't just pass through your system, that like you kind of, it poisons you a little bit, and it can actually sort of over generations it can kind of snowball into a kind of a very virulent, sort of uh, uh, toxin, or it, and we've moved with this toxin in our system, and it's sort of, it's like a virus, and viruses like aren't always bad because they have an effect on the evolution of DNA, and you have to control them. So like living with viruses, it's sort of, it's not like, it's a complicated, it's not just all evil. It has helped us develop. It is it's kind of been the enemy that has kept us culturally viable and strong, because it's kind of like an internal, so there are those analogies that are important to be mindful of, that and then trying to find the course in terms of dealing with this and managing this with eyes open, with the right amount of vigilance, with the right amount of pragmatism. Because if you give too much energy into this drama, if you give too much attention to this virus, essentially, then it sort of, it's weird. You have to ignore it just the right amount, you have to live with it just the right amount, and you have to create boundaries just the right amount. You can't sort of overreact to it, because then you kill yourself as well. So I mean, this has been sort of generally the plight of men within culture and civilization, is having to mediate this cultural effigy of essentially the female opportunistic sexual strategy, which I would say, you know, which is usually appeased when you have a caste system. If you have any society that has slavery generally, and I'm talking about like the Roman system of slavery, when you have very strict classes or castes that you can't overcome within your lifetime, when it's just sort of your fate. If you have any kind of structure in life that dictates fate, then you kind of put a lid on this, because it doesn't really have the kind of ideological opportunism. If you Because it's sort of, this virus particularly, if you just have any kind of free imagination, it can completely take over that imagination, and it can regulate its world. It can sort of expand its worldview into that imagination, into creating a kind of a an imagined way of sort of reframing reality to yeah. But it's got this very strange corrosive sanctimoniousness about it, and this very sort of convenient way of being able to just cherry pick reality in order to kind of protect its circular reasoning and its circular arguments, which are themselves even kind of held in a kind of mythology, so that you never worry about the circular reasoning in it, because it's baked into the historical mythology, and then which gives you your sense of rightness in wearing your identity and adopting your identity and inheriting your identity and the cause of the identity. This is blood and soil. This is the sacred victim of some kind of historical sort of thing, which just completely disconnects you from the actual, what the real problem is, what the real solution is. You look past that because your concern is with the identity. Your moral consideration flows from the identity, the issue of the identity. So, and when you have to sort of try to champion a generalization, then you have no room to, then you need symbols, you need tokens. You don't actually have to care about real people on the ground, and there are real problems on the ground, because you can just kind of, as long as you share that superficial quality, then, the rich can use the poor as a human shield. There's policies can be as sort of stupid as you wish. They don't have to target anything that actually solves the problem. It just kind of papers over it. You can create sort of artificial, and I mean also the kind of the facilitation of propaganda, as you create sort of a very unsustainable artificial solution. Um, and it's funny because, like, the more that their solution fails, the more they just say, well, that's proof that we should just burn everything down. That's just sort of, it naturally escalates, because it's so locked into its sort of tunnel reality. But anyway, okay, this is too much of a rant. But yeah, so the thing is that we've lost track of how people used to play the game of culture. We've lost track of the fact that there used to be these simple stereotypes, and it's almost like the stereotypes were just the initial game pieces that people had modeled in their mind. They didn't necessarily have that much weight. And there were still people, and yes, there are always superficial people that will just be hypnotized by whatever the cultural image that's made famous is. There will always be people that do that will just look for the tokens of high status and try to replicate them, try to exude that image. Um, but essentially, there was there was a stable game. Now there's a destabilized game, because essentially the idea is that those containers need to be dictated to us by a kind of political entity, by a sort of a new imagined sort of arbitration over us, that the system needs to be saved and dictated to by a kind of cultural totalitarian. This is essentially it's at least proto-fascism. I would just call it, cultural fascism or something like that. And that's what these Antifa people are. They're cultural fascists. Um, Ironically, they call themselves anti-fascists. Um, but essentially, they want self-esteem to be regulated by the cause of the identity. They want people's self-esteem to be invested into their identity consideration. They want everything to be translated into identitarian issues. And obviously, this is yeah. And then you can control a population with propaganda and virtue signaling, and you can disorientate them and delude them very, very easily, because you just need to tell them things about the generalization, and it has nothing to do with anything to do with their life, but you're just telling them things about the generalization in terms of a narrative that's working itself out. It's just kind of, it's like a grand vision, and it's surreal. It's hyperrealism, the same hyperrealism in Weimar Germany. um, So I guess the thing about Anchorman, which is kind of maybe one of the meta themes in that, I think it's two movies, or maybe it's even three. I can't remember. Is that, well, I mean, I'm going to project this meta theme onto it. Perhaps it's not really there, but I'm reading into it, perhaps. But is that you can only have a culture if you know essentially that it is just a a wireframe. It's just lines in the sand to some degree, and it's not important. It's not that important. You just need a stable structure, because you need an initiating point. You need something to start the conversation with. You need something that frames the conversation. It used to be that the reason why people would dress in certain ways is because the dress was significant. The when I not just a woman, I mean the dress. You were signaling something. You were saying something about a stage in your life, or about an activity that you were doing, and about it was a way to facilitate connecting with people. I guess I'm thinking specifically about courtship. That people of a certain age would wear something particular, and that would signal that something about their interest, or something about their availability, in terms of that they were on the market or looking for something. Like it would say something about the stage of your life, or about I mean, very, very sort of vaguely within a wide spectrum, but essentially there were some universal markers that basically um, you know you could only use culture to do very, very simple things. You couldn't do complex things. That came within the actual negotiation of the individuals that were merely presented to one another through the cultural lens, as it were, and that cultural lens was stable. Now, essentially, that cultural lens is what is being fought over through the cultural totalitarians, through the borderline sort of value system, because that's always how they've unilaterally dictated things, is that they've leveraged cultural conventions into creating drama that they could force people to kind of eke through and endure, and to and to be the backdrop of their, usually, their codependency dramas, or whatever, their parasitic trust, and things like that. because you have to make people trust in superficial characteristics in order to tie them into the drama, in order to force them to play through the gauntlets that you have designed in order to decompartmentalize them, because that is how borderlines attach to their host. They need access to a level of psychological penetration, and they can only do that when they've got people that are on the hook for something, and they have to be on the hook for reifying and validating the superficial narrative that is being communicated. This is why borderlines, they need to be telling their truth, they need to be broadcasting their narrative, and they need an audience, they need someone to exhibit it to and to absorb it, so that they can become decompartmentalized and become the fluid mush that sorts out the kind of the distrust that is being communicated in their parasitic trust narrative, that the narrative has a kind of parasitic trust which they don't want to work out how to navigate trust as an individual. They want somebody else to kind of police it for them, to make trust out of a confusing, convoluted narrative. This is why borderlines are often sort of chaos merchants. They try to convolute and make something as confusing as possible and layer on things, so that you just have to kind of try to work out what's going on and then make yourself accountable and responsible for the resolution, which then is then delivered to the person who's been unilaterally dictating the narrative. So that you're on the hook to pandering, to satisfying the whatever anguish or whatever anxiety that you have to be the emotional butler, essentially, to the kind of the dilemma of trust which is inculcated into the narrative. And they're simple, naive creatures, so they can't, it's not for them to clean up their narrative and to navigate it like an individual. No, they have to see what it looks like to them and give their subjective feeling and their self-esteem, which is not being satiated, and somebody else must guarantee their self-esteem by uplifting their narrative and by making it by trying to stabilize it instead of trying to collapse it and say, grow up, be mature, navigate life without a kind of parasitic trust, without this ideological trust, and forcing people to believe in superficial things. Take responsibility for the fact that you got yourself into a hole. Stop trying to treat people that you give these exhibitions to and the subjective stream of consciousness, stop trying to make them your parent, essentially. And this is what Führer means. Führer means the savior. That's the role. The host for the borderline is essentially the Führer figure. Is the anyway? So I mean, I'm just describing how feminism has essentially completely morphed into at least a variation of Nazi philosophy. It obviously has the same formula. It just has slightly different window dressing, essentially. It's slightly deeper than that, because essentially this is what Hitler would have basically, I don't know if he came up with the term proto-fascism, but I know that Hitler understood this. I can't remember. There are excerpts, but essentially, useful idiot. That the phrase "useful idiot" was something that Hitler understood well, and he knew essentially. He said himself that the useful idiots will either become fascist, either become full-blown fascists, or we'll just get rid of them. But basically, they promote fascistic ways of thinking. They promote fascistic philosophy, but they don't buy into our brand. But they have the same way of thinking, but they don't have the common sense to kind of just invest in a single identity, and Hitler even critiques them, and he says, obviously you can't run a state on proto-fascism, because it's like a state can only look after one identity. It can't look after more than one identity. It's impossible. And so essentially, Hitler says that either these people will reach common sense and they will basically they'll grow up into full-blown fascists, where they'll stop caring about different identities and they'll only care about their own, or they'll only care about one identity, and they'll only want the state to endorse one identity, essentially, or the interest of one identity, or we'll have to get rid of them because they'll be corrosive idiots, and so Hitler just called these people useful idiots. Um, and I mean, I've given more detailed descriptions as to, I call them the difference between the monkeys and the dogs. So I mean, I do this in a way to debunk fascism as well, because fascism is a very pathetic ideology. It's a very stupefying, soulless, thing. But essentially, it's the difference between um, being a sort of, because you see, dogs belong to their pack, and they have one pack, and they have the same mentality as any other dog, but they'll fight other dogs because they belong to different packs. So that's what a fascist is they have a dog mentality. And then the proto-fascist has a kind of monkey mentality, where they think that they're cleverer than the monkeys, but monkeys will be torn apart by wolves, or dogs, so it's monkeys will be overcome by the pack. So but and I'm not going to go into all that sort of, it's not really relevant to this at all, so I'm not going to go into that. But in an abstract way, there is a kind of intellectual synthesis that makes sense, but it's completely disembodied, and it works off of presumptions which are completely fanciful. The idea that essentially there is some identity essentialism that is worth reducing society into. Why is it worth categorizing and conceptualizing society in terms of an identity reduction? Who knows? Like, they just like to do it because it gives you an abstraction to work with. It gives you an abstraction to model, and to say, well, if we can just treat people as tokens of a subset of humanity, then that is the way to broker out issues, or something like that. That is the way to redistribute power, and it's a dehumanizing way, because it treats power like it's just a kind of, like it's just a hollow commodity, like it has no pragmatic under it, like it's not connected to any value system. You have to kind of be um, sort of agnostic as to the issue of values. You have to basically believe that human beings are just kind of meat machines. It's grounded in a kind of soulless sort of determinism, and that's also why they cling to their mythology, because essentially, they believe that the mythology is fundamentally arbitrary, that it is fundamentally hollow, but they just think that, well, we have to make life a mythology, otherwise it won't have any meaning. So essentially, they outsource the problem to an external authority. They're like, well, life, they're basically nihilists at their heart, and they just believe, well, if we get a group of people to make an identitarian cult and to create a mythology around it, then at least I can feel important by helping to promote that mythology. I can be like a grand dragon wizard or whatever, which is essentially what all these, sort of purple-haired gender studies, queer studies people are. All the ones with all the piercings, and they've got their credentials, they've got their high titles, and then they basically walk around like, oh, I'm a doctor, I'm a PhD in gender studies. And so essentially they are like some grand wizard, within the KKK. That's the kind of, I mean, that's why the KKK calls them grand wizards and stuff like that, is because that is the function that they have. They are anchoring the culture in a kind of magical thinking. I mean, and that's also what these so-called academics are doing when they make themselves up to be like, it's like Hitler with his mustache. It's like, very few people are allowed to do this. It's like, I've got my own unique brand of synthesis and subjective interpretation, because essentially it's relativism made orthodox. That's what they're facilitating, that's what they're promulgating. So you need to have either a special title, Grand Dragon Wizard, or obviously they don't call themselves Grand Dragon Wizards, they just have PhDs. So then they have PhDs and they look like how they look, which is essentially that's their regalia. That's their unique regalia. They're so special that they invent their own regalia into their own relativistic consideration. So it's this sort of this idea that and that's also how the ideology functions to some degree, is essentially on the back of the scapegoat they get to reimagine society, excavating it out of a kind of historical injustice. The idea that the historical injustice is a blank check that then must be delivered to us as we dictate and utter the new world into a radical creation of defiance. And so essentially the idea is that destabilization is the the birth the birthing of a from the ashes will come a magnificent sort of thing. So the idea is that essentially we don't have to build anything, we don't have to positively understand how to do anything, we just have to remove our obstacles and then we get what we want. It's that kind of bait and switch, sort of magical thinking. That essentially they don't have to positively know what they want, they just have to brand a scapegoat and fight and oppose the scapegoat, and then they are at the same time extracting from the scapegoat the thing that they think that they want, which they haven't even described. It's a kind of it's a weird kind of vague sentimentality, and in fact without the scapegoat they can't even have a license to imagine. So it's very problematic. That their whole worldview is based on parasitically extracting a kind of negative valuation of injustice. Essentially, without injustice, they don't have fuel to burn. It's very sad. And they don't even realize how detached and disempowered they have made themselves by inducting themselves into this kind of solipsistic, relatively autistic, sort of self-referencing, tautological worldview, circular reasoning and such, that the conclusions of their own ideological narrative are used as the premises in their own ideological narrative. It's so pseudo-intellectual, and they brazenly talk about how brilliant it is that it's pseudo-intellectual. And then there's this supposedly black intellectual economist or something like that, Du Bois, who basically reinvented proto-fascism in our modern era. And so he, it's the same level of intellectualism in Weimar Germany, 1920s. It's that same level of pseudo intellectual fakery and hucksterism, and it's just how brave they are that they call themselves black intellectuals. Like how paradoxical to call yourself a black intellectual, because they're not intellectuals like other people are intellectuals. They're like these new radical fascistic, sort of new breed of something. It's and I mean, this is the problem, is that they're not denounced, they're not confronted, because of the hyperrealism essentially, around these sacred cows. And that's also how feminism protects itself. When you hear this irate, you don't even know what feminism is, repeated a million times, interrupting you, because that's all they have, is this kind of blanket denial. They can't reason. They can just they just claim deep as a kind of the moral high ground as their default. And it's very easy to pander to a stupid audience that doesn't understand that like something has not been established, that positive reasoning has not been provided, that just like a very circular reasoning, a very sort of convoluted circular narrative has been that you've been incepted into this grand spell, that has dissolved, any kind of accountability for, reasonable, intelligent decision making on the level of policy. There's the ideological solution always remains the same. The question just is like, I mean, this was actually a problem within Nazi. The Nazi philosophy was essentially that they understood their own ideology, but they didn't know if, because essentially the biggest problem within the fascist worldview is that if you fail, was it because your leaders failed the ideology, or was it because the ideology failed the people? And they were even sensitive to that paradox, and how they overcame the paradox was what they called the Führer principle. And the Führer principle was required in order to create enough of a stable cult in order for, the politics of a totalitarian state to manifest. And I mean, that is essentially the only thing that stands. That's the only reason why we haven't, the West is saddled with proto-fascism now, of these identitarians, of these, of the so-called left. I mean, that's what the Democratic Party is. They're basically a party of proto-fascists. And it's very easy for them to trade on that ideology because, it's a spring that never runs dry. They can always just make the next one is just going to be the latest proto-fascist that is part of this wave, and because they don't have a Führer principle that ties it to a particular individual, or they can try to renew that ambit, and eventually, I mean, if it doesn't break down, I hope that it will break down at some point. But if it doesn't break down, it will eventually sort of metastasize into a kind of, well, it's interesting. I mean, I think, well, no, I mean, that's actually probably not even the model. I mean, eventually the thing is that if this is not culturally confronted and dissolved, then it will actually precipitate fascist politics, because you can't have this many people who think about society in this way. I mean, which is basically, it's indistinguishable from the fascistic conception of society. I mean, that's essentially what this movement is. It's goading fascists to exist. It's trying to provoke them into, it's like race baiting people to become fascist. Essentially, is what it is. It's disgusting to watch. It's so pathetic to watch, because it's such an abstraction, such a diversion, such an invented problem. It's completely, it's virtually brought into the political arena. It doesn't exist there. It's only put there by these disgusting identitarian ideologues. Because even if it had its way, and you had a kind of monkey proto-fascist sort of arbitration between different identities in a state, the solutions would not be solutions. They would just create destabilization. They would destroy meritocracy. They would bring everything down to a lower level of functioning, because of all the checks that would be introduced, mucking things up, getting in the way, creating quotas and obstacles to authentic networking. It would create so many artificial sort of debilitation in the system, a disability. It would impose disabilities on everything, that it would create so much resentment, and then that resentment would, like, in all likelihood, rebel against sort of inverting whatever the disability that was imposed was. It would just, react sort of relatively blindly to the disability that was being imposed, which maybe, I mean, that isn't so bad, in the fact that, like, it might not just be a blind reaction. People might just actually say, well, this is why we need non-racialism, and then you have a market for selling non-racialism as the solution to this. That we've basically betrayed the vision of Martin Luther King. We've betrayed the vision of the new South Africa. We've betrayed the constitution of South Africa as well. I'm talking as a South African, but we've taken a non-racialist document and we have interpreted it according to this latest pseudo-intellectualism, fad in sort of racial obsessed sort of narrative making. Anyway, let me stop this. I almost wonder if this isn't a kind of confusion that was laid onto the fact that, that this all happens while feminism is happening in the background. But was that their whole was that their whole plan? Is they just wanted to kind of destabilize the system enough to kind of demoralize it, so then they can sort of be unopposed when they sort of try to. It's weird because race has become much more important than the sex issue. So I think that's because people almost naturally don't want to create this toxic division, or there's more reticence in creating a kind of toxic division that divides men and women, because it's gone on now for like 2.5 generations, and I think people are seeing how kind of artificially generated it is, like how vacuous it is, how even hypocritical it is, when you look at all these studies that are done on these women who basically hold this huge cognitive dissonance between what their ideology tells them about what they want and then what they actually want, in terms of, like that they don't want a traditional man, but they want the man to pay for all the meals, and they want to be asked out. It's a kind of, it's just a hodgepodge of hypocrisy and double standards and just craziness. It's like self-delusion. It's like how you going to put up with these kinds of indoctrinated women that have this weird ideological picture in their head, and it's completely divorced from even their own behavior. That's how incoherent they are. Self-deluded they are. It's a bit crazy. And then how they rationalize that inconsistency. How they have to then they even have like weird rationalizations for their cognitive dissonance. It's like it's a nightmare. It's such a diversion. You just think about the poor men that have to deal with that kind of trauma and abuse of having to sort of be pulled in all these different directions and then scapegoated for the fact that she has this impossible contradictory standard in her mind. It's like you couldn't even I think these kinds of examples are good for the next generation, because hopefully that they will absorb all this complexity, and they will basically see through it, that well, if you don't care about values, this is where you get to superficial moral codes that mean absolutely nothing, just so that people can pretend to virtue signal and be high status within this crypto fascist ideological pecking order or whatever. That it's just it pretends to be one thing and it's the exact opposite.